Good evening and a very warm welcome, humble viewer. Before we get into this tale of legend, of mystery, of revenge, but also love, I wanted to say that I'm so glad you've decided to join me tonight. Wherever you are, I hope you can find a comfortable space, perhaps with a warm drink or settled into a favorite chair, or maybe you are already lying down, ready to let the day's concerns drift away. Settle in and allow the world outside to fade, just for a while. I'm always so curious to know where in the world you might be listening from and what time it is for you as we begin. For some, it may be the deep of night, while for others, a quiet afternoon is just beginning. If you feel so inclined, please feel free to leave a comment below sharing your city or country and the time on your clock. It's a wonderful way for us to feel a quiet sense of connection in this shared space. Tonight, we begin a journey, a long and truly unforgettable journey into one of the great epics of literature. We will be exploring the intricate world of Alexandre Dumas' masterpiece, The Count of Monte Cristo. This is a story of dizzying heights and crushing lows, of profound love and bitter betrayal, of meticulous, patient revenge, and ultimately of redemption. We will not be rushing, we will take our time, walking step by step with our hero through every trial and every triumph. So, let us begin. Our narrative commences on a specific date, a date which anchors our story in a period of immense political turmoil for France. It is the 24th of February in the year 1815. The location is the bustling port city of Marseille, a vibrant nexus of commerce and seafaring life on the Mediterranean coast. From the watchtower of Notre-Dame de la Garde, a sentinel post that had for centuries surveyed the vast expanse of the sea, a signal is given. A ship has been sighted. It is a three-masted vessel, identified swiftly by experienced eyes as the Pharaon, a merchant ship whose home port was this very city. The ship is returning from a long voyage, having called at the ports of Smyrna in the Ottoman Empire, Trieste in the Austrian Empire, and Naples. The arrival of any large vessel was an event of note, a break in the daily rhythm of the port that drew a crowd of idle and interested spectators to the quays. But the Pharaon was a vessel of local importance. It was the property of the firm Morel & Son, owned by Monsieur Pierre Morel, a man widely known and respected throughout Marseille for his integrity and his fair dealings. The ship was a tangible symbol of local prosperity, and its safe return was a matter of civic as well as commercial pride. Immediately upon the signal, a small, sturdy pilot boat was dispatched from the harbour. Its task was to meet the incoming vessel and guide it safely through the complex and sometimes treacherous approaches to the port. The pilot boat cut through the choppy blue-green water, its course taking it past the imposing and grim silhouette of the Château d'If, a fortress prison squatting on its own island, a place of dread and dark legend. The pilot would intercept the Pharaon somewhere between the rocky promontory of Cape Morgiou and the smaller island of Rion. Even from a distance, however, it was apparent to the seasoned observers on the shore that something was amiss. A collective, unspoken anxiety began to ripple through the crowd. A ship returning in triumph after a long and profitable voyage typically displayed a certain panache. It would sail proudly, with a full complement of sail, its pennants flying, its crew visible and active on the deck, their movements betraying the cheerful energy of a homecoming. The Pharaon, by contrast, presented a somber and troubling picture. It moved sluggishly, almost cautiously, under a severely reduced set of sails. Only its foresail and jib were unfurled against the wind. The figures on its deck moved not with celebratory haste, but with a slow, deliberate gravity. There was an air of mourning about the ship, a palpable gloom that seemed to travel across the water and settle upon the onlookers. Aboard the pilot boat, accompanying the official coastal pilot, was a young man. He was 19 years of age, though the confidence of his bearing made him seem older. He was of a lean and tall build, moving with the natural grace of someone utterly at home on the shifting deck of a ship. He possessed striking features, eyes of a deep, intelligent black, and hair as dark as polished jet. His skin was bronzed by a Mediterranean sun, and his entire demeanor radiated a calm competence and a youthful vitality. His name was Edmond Dantès. As the pilot boat drew alongside the much larger Pharaon, Dantès did not wait for a ladder. With an agility born of long practice, he took a running leap, clearing the gap between the two vessels and landing softly and securely on the deck of the merchantman. He was, for all intents and purposes, taking command. On the quay, Monsieur Morel, the ship owner, had been watching the approach of his vessel with a mounting sense of professional and personal dread. He was a man for whom his ships and their crews were more than just assets. They were a responsibility, almost an extension of his own family. Unable to bear the suspense, he had not waited for the Pharaon to dock. He had ordered a small private skiff to be made ready and had set out himself, rowing with urgent, powerful strokes towards his approaching property. He was a man in the prime of his life, his face open and honest, his reputation for benevolence as solid as the stone of the city's fortifications. As his skiff bobbed in the shadow of the Pharaon's hull, he cupped his hands around his mouth and called upwards, his voice filled with anxiety. "Ah, is it you, Dantès?" The young man appeared at the rail, looking down. His expression was serious, but his voice was steady and filled with a deep respect for his employer. "Yes, monsieur," he replied. "What has happened?" Morel demanded, his eyes scanning the deck for other familiar faces, most notably that of his captain. "Why this air of misfortune? The ship appears as if it carries sorrow." "A great misfortune indeed, Monsieur Morel, for us all," Dantès answered, his gaze unwavering. "We have had to endure the loss of our brave Captain Leclerc. He died during the voyage." The news struck Morel with significant force. Captain Leclerc had been more than an employee. He was a known quantity, a skilled mariner, and a man whose political loyalties, which quietly mirrored Morel's own Bonapartist sympathies, made him a trusted agent in sensitive matters. "And what of the cargo?" Morel asked, the practical concerns of a merchant momentarily overriding his grief. A lost captain was a tragedy. A lost cargo was a financial catastrophe. "The cargo is all safe and sound, Monsieur Morel," Dantès reassured him. "Every last crate and bale is accounted for and in good condition. The business of the ship has been meticulously attended to. It is now the business of men that requires our attention." Satisfied on this critical point, Morel instructed the men in his skiff to bring him alongside, and he climbed the rope ladder thrown down to him, his movements agile for a man of his station. He stepped onto the deck of his ship and was met by two key figures. The first was Edmond Dantès, the acting captain. The second was a man who had been observing the entire exchange from a position of calculated proximity. This was the ship's supercargo, or purser, a man named Danglars. Danglars was a man of approximately 25 years of age, though a certain sourness of expression and a perpetual air of grievance made him seem older. He was of a physically unprepossessing nature, and his typical demeanor was one of fawning civility towards his superiors, a trait that barely concealed a deep well of resentment and ambition. He positioned himself close to Morel, an unspoken offer in his posture to provide his own account of events, an account one could surmise would be carefully calibrated to serve his own interests. He saw himself as the natural successor to the captaincy and viewed Dantès, his junior in age and rank, as an upstart rival. Morel, a man of direct and honest nature, addressed Dantès first, seeking a clear and unvarnished report. "Tell me everything, my boy. How did this tragedy with Captain Leclerc occur?" Dantès recounted the events with the clarity and precision of a ship's log. "Off the coast of Civitavecchia," he began, "the captain was suddenly struck down by a violent brain fever. It came on without warning. One day he was giving orders, the next he was delirious. We did everything we could, but the malady was too powerful. He suffered for a day and a night, and then he was gone." Dantès paused, a flicker of genuine sorrow in his eyes. "In accordance with maritime tradition, we prepared his body for burial at sea. We committed him to the waves off the coast of the island of Giglio. We said our prayers, and we continued on our course." As Dantès spoke, Danglars saw his opening to introduce doubt. He adopted a tone of grudging concern, a rhetorical device intended to sound like helpful criticism. "And in doing so," he interjected, his words directed at Morel, "we lost a day and a half of time at the island of Elba. It was an unscheduled stop, entirely unnecessary. We could have made directly for Marseille and arrived sooner." The implication was clear. Dantès had exercised poor judgment, possibly for reasons of his own. Dantès turned to face the purser. His expression was not one of anger, but of surprise at such a petty and misleading accusation. His response was firm, grounded in the unassailable logic of duty. "I was bound to fulfill the final orders of my captain, Danglars. That is the first duty of a first mate." On his deathbed, in a moment of lucidity, Captain Leclerc entrusted me with a package. He made me swear an oath that I would deliver it personally into the hands of Marshal Bertrand. The name of the island, Elba, hung in the air with electric significance. In the political landscape of 1815, Elba was not just a geographical location. It was a symbol, a flashpoint. It was the place of exile for the deposed Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. The restored Bourbon monarchy under King Louis XVIII was fragile, and its agents were in a state of constant, paranoid vigilance against any hint of Bonapartist conspiracy. To have any contact whatsoever with the exiled emperor or his loyal court, which included the Grand Marshal Bertrand, was to engage in an act of profound political risk. It bordered on treason. Morel, whose own sympathies lay with the exiled emperor, understood the danger more acutely than anyone. A public scandal could ruin his business and endanger his liberty. "And you did this, Dantès?" he asked, his voice lowered, a new layer of anxiety in his tone. "You went ashore?" "I did precisely as I was commanded," Dantès replied, his voice still holding the clear, untroubled note of a man with a clean conscience. "I saw no reason to disobey a dying man's last wish. I anchored the Pharaon in the harbour of Porto Ferrajo. I went ashore and found the marshal's residence. I delivered the package as instructed." He then added, as if it were a minor detail, "I even spoke for a moment with the emperor himself." A sharp, almost theatrical intake of breath came from Danglars, who was watching Morel's face with keen, malevolent interest. Morel's expression was now a mask of deep concern. "You spoke with the emperor?" "He summoned me," Dantès explained, with the unaffected frankness that was his nature. "He asked me a series of questions about the Pharaon. He wanted to know the exact date of its departure for Marseille, the precise course it had taken, the nature of the cargo it carried. His inquiries were as detailed and exacting as those of a customs official. When he was satisfied, he entrusted me with a letter. He instructed me to deliver it to a specific individual in Paris." "And the name of this individual?" Morel pressed, his apprehension palpable. "The letter is addressed to a Monsieur Noirtier on the Rue Coq-Héron in Paris," Dantès replied. He spoke the name without any awareness of its political weight. To him, it was just a name and an address, part of a solemn duty he had undertaken. To Morel, however, the name was a thunderclap. Noirtier was not just some minor functionary. He was a known and highly influential figure from the days of the Revolution, a Girondin, a man whose Bonapartist sympathies were infamous in royalist circles. A letter passing from the exiled Emperor Napoleon to the conspirator Noirtier was not a simple piece of correspondence. It was the potential blueprint for a revolution, and his first mate, his ship, had been the unwitting vehicle. Danglars observed all of this, his mind working with cold precision. He saw the fear on Morel's face. He saw Dantès' complete, almost childlike innocence of the political firestorm he was describing. The young sailor, in his guileless honesty, had just handed his most bitter enemy a perfectly crafted weapon. Morel, however, was a man who judged character above all else. He looked at Dantès and he saw not a conspirator, but a loyal, dutiful, and exceptionally competent young sailor who had been placed in an impossible position by his dying captain. He saw integrity where Danglars saw an opportunity for ruin. After a long moment of internal deliberation, Morel made a decision that would seal the fates of all three men. He placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Dantès' shoulder. "My dear Dantès," he said, his voice firm and decisive, "it is perfectly clear to me who is best suited to take the helm of this vessel. You have navigated not only the sea, but also a great tragedy with a skill and maturity that far exceeds your years. The position of captain of the Pharaon is yours. I will formalize it with my partner, but as of this moment, you may consider yourself the master of this ship." This declaration acted as a catalyst. For Edmond Dantès, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the fulfillment of his professional ambitions, a dream realized. The promotion meant a handsome salary, the ability to provide a life of comfort and dignity for his aging father, and, most crucially, it removed the final obstacle to his marriage. He could now marry his beloved, the beautiful Catalan girl, Mercedes. For Danglars, the words were like a physical blow. He had been so certain the captaincy would be his. He had schemed for it, flattered for it, waited for it. To see it given to this 19-year-old boy, this rival whom he despised, was an insult so profound it felt like a personal wound. His simmering professional jealousy instantly crystallized into a cold, hard, and patient hatred. He offered a thin, false smile of congratulation, murmured some obsequious words, and then retreated into the shadows of the rigging, his mind already beginning the dark and intricate work of plotting his revenge. Overwhelmed with happiness, Dantès wasted no more time. He took his leave of Monsieur Morel, his heart soaring, and quickly disembarked, striding with a light step onto the familiar stones of the Marseille quay. His first destination was not to celebrate, but to share his good fortune. He hurried through the noisy, sun-drenched streets of the city, his path taking him to the Allée de Meilhan, where his father lived in a small fifth-floor apartment. He bounded up the stairs and entered the modest dwelling. He found his father, Louis Dantès, alone. The old man's delight at the sight of his son was immediate and overwhelming, but Edmond's initial joy was quickly tempered by a deep concern. His father looked shockingly frail, his face pale and gaunt, his body weakened. Pressing him for an explanation, Edmond learned the distressing truth. During his absence, their neighbor, a tailor by the name of Gaspard Caderousse, had come to call on an old debt. The sum was 140 francs, money that Edmond had himself lent to his father before his voyage. Bound by a strict and uncompromising sense of honor, the old man had insisted on repaying Caderousse the moment he asked for it. Left with almost no money and too proud to ask for help, Louis Dantès had spent the last 3 months living on a pittance, subsisting on the barest of rations, effectively starving himself to satisfy the debt. A flash of hot anger shot through Dantès, anger at Caderousse for his merciless avarice, and a tender, frustrated anger at his father for his punishing pride. He immediately emptied his own pockets, pressing all the money he had earned from his voyage into his father's trembling hands. He promised him that from that day forward, their days of poverty were over. He would ensure his father lived in comfort and wanted for nothing. After ensuring his father had food and was settled, Dantès left for his second and most anticipated visit. He made his way to the outskirts of Marseille, to the small, distinct community known as the village of the Catalans. This was a tight-knit enclave of fishermen and their families of Spanish origin who kept largely to themselves, maintaining their own customs and traditions. It was here that his fiancée, the woman he loved with all the fervor of his young heart, Mercedes, lived. He found her in the small, whitewashed cottage she shared with her family, but she was not alone. In her company was her cousin, Fernand Mondego. Fernand was a local fisherman, a young man of about 21, tall and powerfully built. He was considered handsome, with dark Catalan features, but his face was perpetually clouded by a brooding, sullen intensity. Fernand was consumed by a deep and obsessive love for his cousin Mercedes, a love she did not return. Consequently, he viewed Edmond Dantès not merely as a rival, but as the living embodiment of his own frustration and misery. The atmosphere inside the small cottage was charged with an unspoken, volatile tension. Mercedes's love for Dantès was a thing of pure and radiant certainty. The moment she saw him, her face lit up with a joy so profound it seemed to illuminate the entire room. She ran to him, and their embrace was one of passionate, heartfelt reunion. Fernand was forced to stand and watch this display, a silent witness to the happiness of the man he hated. Every smile from Mercedes, every look of love she gave to Dantès was a fresh torment to him. He felt his own love being spurned, his own desires rendered worthless. His envy was a corrosive acid in his heart, mirroring in its passionate, personal nature the cold, professional jealousy that consumed Danglars. Dantès, largely oblivious to the depth of Fernand's animosity, spent a few blissful moments with Mercedes. He told her of his promotion, of his plans for their future. He promised to return the very next day for their official betrothal feast, after which their wedding would swiftly follow. He then departed, leaving the two cousins alone once more. The moment Dantès was gone, Fernand made one last, desperate appeal to Mercedes. He pleaded with her, declared his undying love, begged her to choose him instead. She responded with a gentle but firm finality, reaffirming her absolute and unwavering love for Edmond. Her rejection, though kind, was the final blow to Fernand's wounded pride. Humiliated and enraged, he turned and fled from the cottage, running blindly, his mind a storm of jealousy and despair. His desperate flight carried him away from the sea and towards the city, his path eventually leading him to a specific harbourside tavern, a place called La Réserve. It was here, in this common drinking establishment, that fate, or rather malevolence, had arranged a meeting. It was here that the three separate streams of resentment, greed and jealousy were to merge into a single, destructive river. As Fernand entered the tavern, his eyes wild, his breathing ragged, he saw two familiar figures seated at a rough wooden table. One was Danglars, the ship's purser, who was methodically sipping a glass of cheap wine, his gaze fixed on the harbour, his mind clearly occupied with dark thoughts. The other was their mutual neighbour, Gaspard Caderousse, the tailor whose collection of the debt had nearly starved Dante's father. Caderousse was a man defined by weakness. He was in his late 20s, fundamentally lazy, and possessed a character easily swayed by temptation. His moral compass was a fickle instrument, its needle swinging wildly in the direction of a free glass of wine or the promise of a few francs. He was not, at his core, as malicious as Danglars, nor as passionately hateful as Fernand, but his avarice, his envy of his neighbour's good luck, and his lack of firm principles made him the perfect malleable instrument for a more determined villain. Danglars, the true architect of the impending plot, observed Fernand's tumultuous entrance with a cold, calculating eye. He immediately understood that the volatile fisherman was now ripe for manipulation. With practiced ease, he began his work. He feigned a friendly sympathy, beckoning Fernand over, pouring him a large glass of wine. He began to skillfully stoke the grievances of both men, painting a carefully curated picture of Edmond Dantès. In Danglars' telling, Dantès was not a talented and deserving young man, but an arrogant and lucky upstart who had unfairly usurped what rightfully belonged to others, the captaincy that should have gone to Danglars, and the woman who should have belonged to Fernand. Caderousse, his judgment already beginning to soften under the influence of the wine, grumbled in agreement. He was easily led into resentment, complaining about the injustice of Dantès' sudden good fortune. "It's no use wishing him harm," Caderousse slurred, his voice thick with drink and envy. "Providence is on his side. He's like a cat, that one. He always lands on his feet. He is to be captain of the Pharaon, and in a day or two, he will marry the beautiful Mercedes." It was the opening Danglars had been waiting for. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a subtle and poisonous seed. "And what if," he said softly, "he were not to marry her?" The question hung in the air. Fernand's head, which had been bowed in misery, snapped up, his eyes, burning with a desperate fire, fixed on Danglars. "What are you saying?" he demanded. Danglars, now in complete control, leaned in further, drawing the other two men into his confidence. He slowly, deliberately, laid out the facts he had gathered. He recounted Dantès' unscheduled stop at the island of Elba. He spoke of the package delivered to Marshal Bertrand. He mentioned the personal audience with Napoleon, and then he revealed the final, damning detail. The letter entrusted to Dantès, addressed to the known Bonapartist conspirator, Monsieur Noirtier in Paris. In the hyper-paranoid political atmosphere of the Bourbon Restoration, this information was explosive. It was more than enough to cast suspicion, to trigger an investigation, to ruin a man's life. An anonymous letter of denunciation sent to the office of the Procureur du Roi, the king's public prosecutor, would be all that was required. Even Caderousse, in his wine-addled state, felt a flicker of moral unease. The idea of informing, of sending a neighbor to prison out of sheer spite, struck him as a step too far. "No," he mumbled, shaking his head. "That is a dirty business. It is a low thing to do, to write such a letter. I will have no part in it." Danglars, a master of human psychology, had anticipated this weak protest. He did not argue. Instead, he feigned immediate agreement, validating Caderousse's momentary flicker of conscience. "You are right, of course, Caderousse. It is a terrible idea. Let us speak of it no more. It was merely a jest, a flight of fancy while drinking." He then produced a pen and a sheet of paper from his pocket. "To prove it is a joke," he said with a dismissive smile, "I will write the letter now, and then we will crumple it up, throw it away, and laugh about it." His actions were a masterpiece of reverse psychology. He began to write, deliberately using his left hand to disguise his natural handwriting. With meticulous care, he composed the text of the denunciation. He adopted the persona of a loyal, concerned citizen, a friend of the throne, who felt it his patriotic duty to warn the authorities. He named Edmond Dantès, first mate of the Pharaon, as a dangerous and committed agent of the usurper, Napoleon Bonaparte. He stated that Dantès was the bearer of seditious correspondence from Elba, intended for the circle of conspirators in Paris. Caderousse, now deeply intoxicated, watched him with bleary eyes, offering only feeble, slurred protests. Fernand, however, watched in absolute, mesmerized silence. His face was a pale mask of concentration, his breath held tight in his chest. He saw in that piece of paper not a contemptible lie, but the miraculous instrument of his salvation. He saw a future where Dantès was gone and Mercédès was his. Danglars finished writing. With a theatrical gesture of dismissal, he crumpled the paper into a tight ball and tossed it into a dark, dusty corner of the tavern. "There," he announced with a final, satisfied air. "The jest is concluded. Let us drink to Dantès' health." He then made his excuses and departed, leaving the other two at the table. He knew his work was done. He had constructed the weapon and placed it within reach of a man desperate enough to use it. Caderousse, his protests forgotten, soon succumbed entirely to the wine and slumped forward, his head on the table, falling into a drunken stupor. Fernand waited. He sat rigid, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, his eyes fixed on the corner where the crumpled paper lay. When he was certain that the tavern keeper was occupied and no one was watching, he rose from his seat. He moved quickly, almost furtively to the corner, bent down and retrieved the damning letter. He smoothed it out, folded it carefully, and secreted it deep within his jacket. The following morning, under the cover of the early city bustle, he found a postbox and dispatched the anonymous denunciation. The trap had been baited, set, and sprung. The next day, as planned, the betrothal feast was held. The chosen venue, in a cruel twist of irony, was that very same tavern, La Réserve. The private room hired for the occasion, however, was transformed. The grim atmosphere of conspiracy was replaced by one of joyous celebration. The room was filled with the friends and family of the happy couple. Edmond Dantès was the radiant center of it all. He was filled with a happiness so complete, so pure and untroubled, that it seemed to emanate from him like a light. He sat at the head of the table, flanked by his two greatest loves, his father, who looked frail but deeply proud, and his Mercédès, who was breathtakingly beautiful, her eyes shining with adoration for her future husband. Monsieur Morel, the benevolent shipowner, was in attendance, lending an air of dignity to the proceedings. Also present, their faces carefully arranged into masks of friendship, were Danglars and Caderousse. Danglars offered smooth, polished congratulations, while Caderousse, nursing a headache, was boisterous in his well wishes. At the edge of the happy gathering, a solitary and sombre figure, sat Fernand Mondego. He was a dark spectre at the feast, his face pale and drawn, his eyes constantly, nervously, darting towards the door. Dantès, in his bliss, spoke openly of his plans. He and Mercédès would be married that very afternoon, as soon as the feast concluded. His first journey as captain would be a short one, to Paris, to fulfill his solemn promise to Captain Leclerc and deliver the letter to Monsieur Noirtier. After that, he dreamed of a simple, happy life. He would buy a small house, provide for his father in his old age, and fill the house with children. His dreams were so humble, so pure, and so close to being realized that knowledge of the impending disaster made the scene almost unbearable to witness. The moment arrived with a sudden, brutal finality. A heavy, authoritative knock sounded at the door. It was not the knock of an invited guest. The festive chatter died instantly. A profound silence fell over the room. The door opened and a man in the formal attire of a magistrate entered, flanked by 4 uniformed and armed soldiers. The magistrate held a document in his hand. His eyes scanned the room, found their target, and he read from the paper in a cold, impersonal voice. "Edmond Dantès, in the name of the law, I hereby place you under arrest." For a moment, there was only stunned disbelief. Then, chaos erupted. Dantès, utterly bewildered, rose to his feet. "Arrest me?" he asked, his voice shaking with confusion. "On what charge? What have I done?" "I am not at liberty to say," the magistrate replied, his tone unyielding. "You will be informed of the nature of the charges during your examination." Monsieur Morel, his face a picture of outrage, stepped forward to intervene. "This is preposterous," he declared. "I will vouch for this young man. He is the most honest and upright man I know. There must be a mistake." He was immediately silenced by the magistrate, who simply stated that he was executing a legal warrant and would tolerate no interference. Mercedes, her face drained of all color, rushed towards Dantès, overcome with a terror that rendered her almost speechless. She clung to him, pleading with the soldiers, her cries lost in the confusion. Dantès' father, his frail health unable to withstand the shock, let out a cry of despair and seemed on the verge of collapsing. Dantès himself, though frightened, was still buoyed by the profound conviction of his own innocence. He truly believed it was all a grotesque misunderstanding, a bureaucratic error that would be rectified as soon as he had a chance to speak to a reasonable authority. He gently detached himself from Mercedes, trying to calm her. "Do not be afraid, my love," he whispered, his own heart pounding with a fear he tried to conceal. "I promise you, it is some trifling mistake. I will be back before dinner. Trust me." He was led from the room by the soldiers. As he was escorted out, his gaze made a final, sweeping survey of the scene of his ruined happiness. He saw Monsieur Morel's face, etched with deep concern and impotent anger. He saw his father's utter, abject despair. He saw Mercedes, who had sunk to her knees, her face buried in her hands, her body racked with sobs. He also saw Danglars, standing in the background, his expression a carefully constructed mask of surprise and dismay. And finally his eyes fell upon Fernand, who had also hidden his face in his hands, though it was impossible to discern whether it was a gesture of guilt or one of overwhelming, triumphant relief. Dantès was not taken to a common city jail. He was escorted to the Palais de Justice, the seat of law and order in Marseille. There, he was placed in a small, bare, windowless anteroom to await his hearing. The minutes stretched into an hour, the hours into a bleak eternity. The sounds of his own betrothal party seemed to belong to another lifetime. The sun set, and the darkness in the room became absolute. At last, the door opened, and he was led into the office of the Deputy Procureur du Roi, the assistant public prosecutor. The man who held Edmond Dantès' fate in his hands was named Gérard de Villefort. Villefort was a young man, only 27, but he possessed an ambition that was vast and utterly ruthless. He was strikingly handsome, from a noble family, but his features were set in a cold, severe cast. For Villefort, politics was not a matter of ideology or conviction, it was a ladder to be climbed. His single greatest liability was his own father, Monsieur Noirtier, the very man to whom Dantès' letter was addressed. To escape the shadow of his father's notorious Bonapartist reputation, Villefort had embraced the royalist cause with the theatrical fervour of a convert. His career, his social standing, and his imminent marriage to the wealthy and well-connected Mademoiselle Renée de Saint-Méran all depended on his ability to demonstrate his unwavering loyalty to the king. When Dantès was brought before him, Villefort was in a state of irritation. He had been called away from his own betrothal dinner to deal with what he assumed was a minor matter of provincial sedition. He began the interrogation with an air of bored condescension. He questioned Dantès about his name, his rank, his ship, his political sympathies. Dantès, with his characteristic and ultimately fatal honesty, answered every question fully and without reservation. He explained the circumstances of Captain Leclerc's death, his solemn oath, the unscheduled stop at Elba, his brief encounter with the exiled emperor, and the letter he had been given to deliver. Initially, Villefort listened with a growing sense of professional satisfaction. A minor Bonapartist plot, uncovered and personally thwarted by him, would be a small but significant feather in his cap. It would be a useful story to tell in the royalist salons of Paris. The case seemed straightforward. He held out his hand. "Give me the letter," he commanded. "It is the primary evidence." Dantès, relieved to be dealing with what he perceived as a reasonable man, quickly produced the folded paper. Villefort took it, examined the seal of Napoleon with a practiced air of disdain, and broke it open. He read the contents quickly. Then he looked up at Dantès, his expression cold and official. "I have read the letter. Now tell me the name of the man to whom this treasonous document is addressed." "It is addressed to a Monsieur Noirtier," Dantès replied, his voice clear and untroubled. "He lives on the Rue Coq-Héron in Paris." The name landed in the room with the force of a physical explosion. Noirtier, his father. For a moment, Villefort could not breathe. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He stared at Dantès, at the young sailor's open, honest, and utterly innocent face, and saw the unwitting agent of his own destruction. The letter, which moments before had been a key to career advancement, was now a death sentence for his ambitions. If this document, this direct link between the usurper Napoleon and his Bonapartist father, were to become public knowledge, his life as he knew it would be over. His marriage to Renée de Saint-Méran would be cancelled, his social standing would be annihilated, his career would be utterly destroyed, he would be disgraced, forever tainted by the tar of his father's treason. His mind, sharp and accustomed to ruthless calculation, raced through the possibilities. He could follow the law. He could forward the letter and the prisoner to his superiors in Paris, as his duty required. In doing so, he would be committing professional and social suicide. Or he could make the problem disappear. He could destroy the evidence, and with it, the man who carried the evidence. His choice, dictated by a lifetime of cold, self-serving ambition, was made in an instant. He had to save himself at any cost. His entire demeanor towards the prisoner underwent a miraculous transformation. The cold, stern magistrate vanished, replaced by a man radiating sympathy and benevolent understanding. He rose from his chair and placed a comforting hand on Dantès' shoulder. "My dear young man," Villefort said, his voice now as smooth as silk, "I see the situation perfectly. You are not a criminal. You are the victim, an innocent pawn in a dangerous political game. The man to whom this letter was addressed is indeed a notorious conspirator, but it is clear to me that you had no knowledge of this. Your only crime was one of misplaced loyalty to your dying captain. I believe you." He walked over to the grand fireplace, where a large fire roared, casting flickering shadows across the room. He held up the letter. "The only piece of evidence that connects you to this affair," he declared, his voice ringing with false magnanimity, "is this single piece of paper. And I," he paused for dramatic effect, "am going to destroy it, to protect you." With a grand gesture, he tossed the letter into the heart of the flames. Dantès watched, his eyes wide with gratitude, as the paper, the physical proof that could have verified his story and thus proven his innocence, blackened, curled, and disintegrated into grey ash. A wave of profound, overwhelming relief washed over Dantès. He felt he might weep with gratitude. "Oh, monsieur," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion, "I cannot thank you enough. You are not just a judge to me, you are my savior, my benefactor." "I am simply a man who values justice," Villefort said, his face a perfect mask of righteousness. "However," he added, his tone becoming serious, "this is a very delicate matter. The conspiracy is real, and to protect you fully, we must ensure absolute secrecy. Therefore, I must detain you for a short while longer. It is a mere formality. To ensure the affair remains completely confidential, you must give me your word that you will not speak of this letter or of the name of the man to whom it was addressed, to anyone, not to your jailers, not to the governor, not to anyone. Your safety depends on your silence. Trust in me." Dantès, in his complete and utter naivety, swore the oath. He placed his entire faith, his life and his liberty in the hands of the ambitious prosecutor. He believed he had found a protector, a powerful man of justice who had recognized his innocence. He was led from the room by the guards, his heart light, convinced that his release was now only a matter of hours away. Left alone, Gérard de Villefort sank heavily into his chair. He was trembling. He wiped a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead. He had contained the threat. He had saved himself. The price was the freedom and life of one innocent man, a price he was more than willing to pay. He took out a fresh piece of paper and a pen. He quickly wrote out an official order of committal. It was not an order for Dantès' release, but for his transfer and indefinite incarceration. Beneath the main order, he added a chilling, decisive addendum, scrawling the words with a firm hand: to be held in the closest and most secure solitary confinement. Prisoner is a dangerous and highly active Bonapartist agent. The matter is of the highest urgency and political sensitivity. No further communication is permitted. He sealed the document with the official stamp of his office and summoned the guards. Dantès was not returned to the anteroom. He was led down a series of dark, stone staircases deep into the subterranean levels of the Palais de Justice. He was thrown into a cold, damp holding cell without a word of explanation. In the deepest hour of the night, he was roused by 2 gendarmes. They shackled his wrists and led him out of the building into the cold night air of the quay. A small boat was waiting. He was forced aboard, and the boatmen began to row out into the black, silent waters of the harbour. As they moved away from the twinkling lights of the city, a monstrous silhouette began to rise before them, stark and terrifying against the star-dusted sky. It was the Château d'If. The name alone was enough to strike terror into the heart of any citizen of Marseille. It was the state prison, a grim, inescapable island fortress reserved for the most dangerous enemies of the crown. It was not a place of justice and reform. It was a tomb for the living, a place where men were sent to be erased from the world, to be forgotten by time itself. A primal terror, cold and absolute, seized Dantès. It was a fear so profound it felt as though the air had been crushed from his lungs. This was not a temporary detainment. This was a sentence of living death. In a final desperate act of rebellion, he tried to fight his captors, to throw himself into the cold, dark water, to choose a quick death over this slow one. But he was young and weakened by his ordeal. They were strong and prepared. He was easily overpowered, brutally subdued, and then dragged from the boat, up the slippery, seaweed-covered stone steps, and through the prison's massive, iron-studded gates, which closed behind him with a sound of utter finality. He was brought before the prison governor, a grim, bureaucratic figure who barely glanced at him, his eyes focused only on the sealed order from Villefort. The governor read the document, his expression unreadable, and then gestured dismissively to a jailer. The jailer, a man with a face as hard and unforgiving as the stone walls around him, took Dantès by the arm and led him away. They traversed a labyrinth of echoing stone passages, climbed a seemingly endless spiral staircase, and finally stopped before a low, heavy wooden door. The jailer selected a large iron key, thrust it into the lock, and turned it. With a groan of protest, the door swung open, revealing a small, dark, stone-walled cell. Dantès was shoved inside. The door was slammed shut. The key turned in the lock. A heavy bolt was driven home. The sound echoed in the crushing, absolute silence of the tomb. Edmond Dantès was left alone, in the dark. The first days, perhaps the first weeks, were a chaotic blur of frantic hope and utter disbelief. He clung to the memory of Villefort's promise with the desperation of a drowning man. This had to be a mistake. It was a temporary measure, a part of the prosecutor's plan to protect him. His release would come, any day, any hour. He paced the confines of his small cell, a caged animal, his footsteps a lonely rhythm on the stone floor. He listened for the sound of footsteps in the corridor, his heart leaping at every distant noise, only to sink back into despair. When the silent jailer brought his daily meager ration of stale bread and a jug of water, Dantès would bombard him with questions, with pleas, with demands to see the governor, to send a message to Villefort. His words were met with an unyielding, indifferent silence. The governor made a single official visit. Dantès, seeing a figure of authority, poured out his story, protesting his innocence, insisting on the terrible mistake, begging for justice. The governor listened without expression and then replied with a single, devastating sentence: "I am strictly forbidden to allow any communication on your behalf." The days bled into weeks, the weeks into months, the months into years. Outside the stone walls of his prison, the world was convulsing. Napoleon, in a stunning turn of events, escaped from Elba and returned to France, marching on Paris and initiating the historical period known as the 100 Days. For a brief, chaotic period, Bonapartists were once again in power. Monsieur Morel, ever loyal, attempted to use his own political connections to plead Dantès' case. But in the turmoil of the restored empire, Dantès' file, deliberately buried by Villefort, could not be found. And then came the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon was defeated for the final time. The Bourbon monarchy was restored, this time with a vengeful and reactionary fervor. Villefort, who had cleverly navigated the political tides, was rewarded for his perceived loyalty with a significant promotion. Any lingering, fragile hope for Dantès' case to be revisited was now extinguished forever. He was a non-person, a forgotten number in a forgotten ledger. Inside the Château d'If, the slow, corrosive passage of time began to work on Dantès' mind. The fierce flame of hope that had sustained him flickered, sputtered, and finally died, leaving behind only the cold, black ash of despair. His initial phase of desperate hope gave way to a second phase, one of violent, volcanic rage. He would scream until his throat was raw, beat his fists against the unyielding stone door until his knuckles were bloody and swollen, and throw his body against the walls, exhausting himself in paroxysms of pure, impotent fury. This period of rage was followed by a third stage, one of intense, desperate prayer. He would fall to his knees on the cold floor and bargain with God. He prayed for justice, for a sign, for a miracle, for deliverance. He would spend entire days in fervent supplication. But the heavens remained silent. The walls remained unmoved. No miracle came. Eventually, the rage burned itself out. The prayers faded into silence. They were replaced by the fourth and most terrible stage, a cold, hollow, soul-crushing despair. He would sit on his small wooden stool for days at a time, unmoving, his eyes staring blankly at the opposite wall. His mind, once so bright and active, became a dull, grey void. He began to lose his sense of self. The confident young sailor, the loving son, the passionate fiancé, that person, Edmond Dantès, ceased to exist. He was only what the prison had made him, prisoner number 34. Years passed in this bleak state. 4, 5, 6. He lost an exact count. He could mark the passage of the seasons only by the subtle changes in the quality of the light that filtered through the high, narrow slit of a window near the ceiling of his cell, or by the temperature of the stone walls. In his moments of lucidity, his thoughts were a torment. He thought of his father, and in his heart, he knew the old man must have died of grief and starvation. He thought of Mercedes. Surely, after so many years, she would have believed him dead. She would have forgotten him. She would have married another. The pain of these thoughts was a physical agony, a constant, dull ache in the center of his chest. After what he calculated to be his 6th or 7th year of captivity, he made a final, rational decision. He resolved to die. It was not a decision made in a fit of passion, but one arrived at through cold, logical deliberation. His life was over. His only remaining freedom was the freedom to choose the moment of his own death. He would starve himself. It was the only act of agency, the only form of control he had left. He began his final protest. He refused his daily rations. When the jailer brought the bread and water, Dantès would take them, and then, after the jailer had left, he would hide the bread in a dark corner and pour the water onto the stone floor. The jailer, a creature of routine, did not notice for several days. But as Dantès grew visibly weaker, his gaunt frame seeming to shrink within his rags, the jailer became suspicious. He tried to force the prisoner to eat, but Dantès, fueled by a final grim determination, resisted. He felt a strange, cold sense of triumph as he felt his body begin to shut down, as the world began to grow dim at the edges. He lay on his hard cot, drifting in and out of a hazy state of consciousness, welcoming the encroaching darkness, the final peaceful release from his unending suffering. He was on the very precipice of death. His mind was beginning to dissolve into the void he had so long desired. And then, one evening, as he lay in the twilight state between life and oblivion, he heard something. It was a sound. It was a dull, rhythmic, scraping noise. It was faint, but it was persistent, and it was coming from the other side of the thick stone wall of his cell. At first, he was certain it was a hallucination, a final trick of his starving, dying brain. He closed his eyes, waiting for it to fade, but it did not fade. The sound continued, steady and methodical. Scrape, pause, scrape. It was not the sound of a rat or the settling of the ancient prison. It was the sound of deliberate work. It was the sound of another human being. A jolt of energy, of pure, unadulterated life force shot through his wasted body. It was an electric shock to his nearly dead soul. The thought, the impossible, miraculous thought of another prisoner, a companion in this stone hell, was a lifeline thrown into the abyss. The desire to die, so absolute only moments before, was instantly and utterly vanquished by an overwhelming primal will to live. He had to make contact. He had to know who was there. With an effort that cost him nearly all of his remaining strength, he slid off his cot and crawled across the cold stone floor, his emaciated limbs trembling violently. He pressed his ear against the solid, damp wall. The sound was clearer now. It was undeniable. Someone was digging. Hope, an emotion he had long since buried and mourned, was resurrected in that instant, fierce and powerful. He knew he had to live. He crawled back to his hidden stash of bread, and with shaking hands, he began to force the hard, stale crusts into his mouth, chewing them painfully, forcing them down his throat. He drank the water from his next ration with a thirst that was for life itself. He had to be strong enough. He had to be lucid enough. He waited, listening, his entire being focused on that one miraculous sound. He waited until he was sure the jailer had completed his nightly rounds and the corridor outside was silent. Then, using the metal handle of the broken water jug that lay in his cell, he began to tap. He struck the stone wall near the source of the sound. He tapped 3 times, a simple, clear signal. Then he held his breath and waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scraping from the other side stopped. An agonizing silence descended. He feared he had startled the other prisoner, that the person would retreat into silence, afraid of discovery. He pressed his ear to the wall again, listening with an intensity that was almost painful. For a long, terrible moment there was nothing, and then he heard it. Faint, hesitant, but unmistakable. A soft tapping in response, a connection, a human response. After years of absolute soul-destroying isolation in the deepest dungeon of the Chateau d'If, Edmond Dantès was no longer alone. The boy who had entered the prison full of innocent hope was long dead. But a new man, a man forged in the crucible of injustice and tempered by years of suffering, was about to be born. His education and his path to vengeance were about to begin. The reintroduction of sound into the silent universe of Edmond Dantès was not a gradual process, but a seismic event. The initial faint scraping from beyond the wall was, to his starving and despairing mind, a phantasm, a trick of a brain beginning to shut down. He had experienced auditory hallucinations before, the phantom cry of a seabird, the imagined whisper of Mercedes's name, but those were fleeting echoes of a lost world. This was different. This sound was methodical, rhythmic, and imbued with an undeniable sense of purpose. It was the sound of labor. After his initial, desperate decision to live, to force nourishment back into his wasted body, Dantès' entire existence reoriented itself around this singular acoustic phenomenon. The scraping became his clock, his calendar, his liturgy. He would lie for hours with his ear pressed against the cold, damp stone, charting the progress he could not see. He learned to distinguish the sharp, percussive sound of a tool striking a hard stone from the softer, grittier sound of crumbling mortar being cleared away. He noted the periods of work, always at night, in the deepest hours of silence between the jailer's rounds, and the long periods of rest during the day. This unseen laborer was cautious, patient, and disciplined. Driven by a desperate need to make contact, to confirm that he was not communing with a ghost, Dantès began his own work. His first tool was the handle of his iron water jug, which had broken long ago. It was heavy and offered a dull point, suitable for chipping away at the soft, decaying mortar between the massive stone blocks of the wall. The work was agonizingly slow and punishingly loud. Each chip of mortar, each scrape of iron on stone, sounded to his terrified ears like a thunderclap that must surely be heard throughout the fortress. His hands, which had once been tough and calloused from years of hauling ropes and climbing rigging, were now soft and unaccustomed to labor. Within the first hour, they were covered in blisters, which soon broke, leaving his palms raw and bleeding. The pain was excruciating, but it was a real physical pain, a welcome distraction from the metaphysical agony that had been his sole companion for so many years. He worked through the pain, his movements becoming more efficient, his fear slowly giving way to a grim determination. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. His cell, once a barren cube of despair, was now a workshop. He discovered other potential tools. A loose metal clamp on his rotting wooden cot, when worked back and forth for days, finally broke free. By rubbing it against the stone floor for countless hours, he sharpened it into a crude but effective chisel. He learned to muffle the sound of his work by hanging his ragged shirt over the area, a pathetic but surprisingly effective sound dampener. He would work until his muscles screamed in protest, until sweat poured down his face and stung his eyes, and then he would lie down, his body aching with a satisfying exhaustion he had not felt since he was a free man. Their communication evolved. A single tap from one side would be answered by a single tap from the other, a confirmation of presence, a greeting in the dark. Soon, they developed a simple code. One tap meant, "I am working." 2 taps meant, "I am resting." And a frantic series of taps was the universal signal for danger, a warning that a jailer was approaching. This simple dialogue, conducted through several feet of solid stone, was the most profound conversation Dantès had engaged in for nearly a decade. The day of the breakthrough was preceded by a change in the sound from the other side. The dull scraping had become more delicate, more cautious. Dantès, pressing his ear to the wall, could hear the faint whisper of plaster being carefully cleared away. He mirrored the action on his side. Then, with a final, gentle push of his makeshift chisel, he felt a sudden lack of resistance. The tool punched through into an empty space. A small cascade of dust and plaster fell into his cell. He had made it. His heart hammered against his ribs with a force that made him dizzy. He carefully, painstakingly widened the opening, his fingers trembling. He peered through the narrow aperture. It was dark, but a sliver of light from a distant lamp cast a faint glow. And then, an eye appeared in the opening. A living, intelligent, human eye. It stared into his for a long moment, a silent, astonished greeting. A voice, raspy from disuse, but clear and articulate, whispered through the hole. "Who are you?" "Edmond Dantès," he whispered back, his own voice a dry, cracking sound. "A prisoner." "And I," the voice replied, "am the Abbé Faria, another. Be patient." The eye disappeared, replaced by the sound of more vigorous, now less cautious, scraping. Soon, a larger stone was dislodged, and a hand emerged, then an arm, then a shoulder. Finally, with a great deal of effort, a man wriggled through the narrow passage and tumbled onto the floor of Dantès' cell. The sight of him was both shocking and pitiable. He was a man of advanced age, though it was impossible to guess how much of his aged appearance was due to years and how much to suffering. He was small of stature and painfully thin, his body little more than a fragile skeleton draped in the tattered rags of a prison uniform. A great mass of unkempt white hair fell to his shoulders, and a long, tangled, yellowish-white beard covered his chest, giving him the appearance of some ancient, forsaken prophet. But all of this physical decay was contradicted by the sheer force of life that burned in his eyes. They were dark, piercing, and possessed an extraordinary, restless intelligence. This was not a man whose spirit had been broken. It was a man whose mind had raged against its cage and remained unconquered. This was the Abbé Faria, He had been incarcerated in the Château d'If since 1811, a full 4 years before Dantès' own arrest. He was an Italian priest, but also a scholar, a scientist, and a political secretary who had dreamed of and worked towards the unification of the fractured Italian states. This ambition had made him a threat to the Austrian Empire and other powers vested in maintaining a weak, divided Italy. He had been arrested in Mainland on trumped-up charges of sedition and spirited away to this French prison, a place for secrets and forgotten men. Faria's first emotion upon entering Dantès' cell was not triumph, but a profound and crushing disappointment. He looked around the small, bare space and then at Dantès, a desperate question in his eyes. "This is not the outside wall?" "No," Dantès replied. The old man let out a cry of pure anguish and struck his forehead with his fist. "Oh, the fool, the idiot I am!" he exclaimed. He explained his grand project, the result of 4 years of unimaginable labor. He had been attempting to tunnel to the outer battlements from where he planned a daring escape. He had painstakingly calculated the distance and trajectory based on his memory of the prison's layout, on conversations with guards, on the direction of the wind and the angle of the sun through his high window. But he had made a fatal error in his calculations. His tunnel, instead of leading to freedom, had led him to the cell of another prisoner. His magnificent, life-consuming project was a failure. He slumped to the floor, a picture of utter dejection. But as he looked at the young man before him, a man clearly in the prime of his physical life, his face a mask of confusion and nascent hope, the abbé's despair began to recede, replaced by a new thought, a new purpose. He had not found an escape route, but perhaps he had found something more valuable, a student, a companion, an heir. And thus, in the grim squalor of cell number 34 of the Château d'If, began one of the most extraordinary courses of education ever undertaken. The Abbé Faria, a true Renaissance man, a polymath whose knowledge spanned the breadth of human inquiry, took on Edmond Dantès as his sole pupil. Their prison cell became a university, their privation the mother of their invention. Faria, with the ingenuity of a Robinson Crusoe, created the tools of learning from nothing. The damp, grey stone walls of the cell became their slate. For a writing instrument, they used pieces of plaster, crumbled to a fine powder, and then reconstituted into a fragile chalk. Their ink was a work of alchemical genius, a mixture of soot scraped from the bottom of their small, smoky lamp, blended with the dregs of the sour red wine that was occasionally given to them on national holidays. It was a faint, brownish fluid, but it was permanent. For pens, they used the sharpened slivers of cartilage found in the heads of the fish that sometimes constituted their meager meals. And for paper, when a permanent record was required, they used the few precious, threadbare scraps of linen from Dantès' original shirt, which he had guarded for years. The curriculum was as vast as Faria's own mind. He began with the foundations. Languages. "A man who knows 2 languages," Faria declared, "is worth 2 men." He taught Dante Italian, his own native tongue, so they could converse without fear of a passing guard understanding a stray word. He taught him the flowing cadences of Spanish and the commercial utility of English. He drilled him in the guttural complexities of German, the language of Kant and Goethe, and explained its philosophical importance. He taught him modern Greek, the language of the merchants and sailors of the Eastern Mediterranean, a practical tool for the world Dantès had once known. And he taught him classical Greek and Latin, the bedrock languages of Western civilization, the keys that would unlock the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Seneca. Dantès, whose mind was like a parched sponge, soaked it all in. His memory, honed by years of forced introspection, proved to be prodigious. What he learned, he never forgot. From the edifice of language, they moved on to the sciences. Faria explained the eternal, immutable laws of mathematics. He started with basic arithmetic, using pebbles on the floor, and progressed to the elegant logic of algebra and the spatial reasoning of geometry. He showed Dantès how physics governed their world, explaining the principles of leverage by using his chisel to pry a stone, the laws of trajectory by observing a spider drop from the ceiling. He taught him chemistry, not as an abstract science, but through the practical application of creating their ink, explaining the properties of carbon and the process of suspension. History was Faria's great passion. He did not teach it as a simple, linear progression of kings and battles. He taught it as a living, breathing organism, a brutal and endlessly repeating cycle of ambition, betrayal, and the ruthless acquisition of power. He had, over the years, written an entire treatise on the political history of a unified Italy on 2 of his old shirts, a secret manuscript he now shared with his pupil. He would spend entire nights unfolding the intricate histories of the great powers. He explained the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, drawing direct parallels between the political machinations of the Senate and the court intrigues of modern France. He recounted the saga of the Florentine Republic, using the story of the Medici to illustrate how a family of merchants could use wealth to purchase power and create a dynasty. He was especially fascinated by the Borgias, telling Dantès in lurid detail how Pope Alexander VI and his son Caesar had perfected the art of political assassination and the appropriation of wealth. These were not just stories to Faria, they were case studies, blueprints for how the world truly worked, stripped of all its moralistic pretenses. He taught Dantès economics, explaining the fundamental difference between simple money, which is used for survival, and capital, which is used to generate more wealth and exert influence. He laid out the principles of investment, of loans, of usury, of how national debts could be used to control governments. He taught philosophy, guiding Dantès through the Stoics, who taught endurance in the face of suffering, a lesson Dantès had already learned in the cruelest possible way, and the political realists like Machiavelli, who taught that power has its own morality. For 2 years, this intensive, all-consuming education continued. The darkness of the prison was illuminated by the light of pure intellect. Dantès was reforged in this mental crucible. The unrefined, instinctual intelligence of the young sailor was transformed. He learned to think critically, to analyze, to see the hidden connections between disparate events. The Abbé Faria was giving him not just knowledge, but a new set of eyes with which to see the world. The final and most crucial part of his education came when Faria turned his analytical gaze from the grand stage of history to the small personal tragedy of his student. One night, as they sat in the darkness, the old man's voice, now soft and gentle, posed a simple question. "Edmond, my boy, you believe your downfall was the result of fate. I do not believe in fate. I believe in causes. Tell me your story again. Leave out no detail, no matter how trivial it may seem." Dantès, for the 100th time, recounted the tale of his ruin. He spoke of the Pharaon's arrival, of Monsieur Morel's kindness, of his promotion. He described the sullen jealousy of Danglars and the brooding, obsessive love of Fernand Mondego. He detailed the final words of Captain Leclerc, the solemn duty of the package, the stop at Elba, the audience with the Emperor, the letter entrusted to him. He spoke the name Noirtier. He described the joy of his betrothal feast, the brutal shock of his arrest, and, most vividly, his interrogation at the hands of the prosecutor, Gérard de Villefort. He recounted Villefort's initial coldness, his sudden shift to paternal concern, his dramatic burning of the letter, and his promise of a swift release. The Abbé Faria listened with the stillness of a predator. He did not interrupt, but his eyes, gleaming in the faint lamplight, missed nothing. He was a detective listening to a key witness, a logician assembling axioms. When Dantès finished, a long, heavy silence descended. "You have given me the facts," Faria said at last, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "You see them as a chain of unfortunate coincidences. I see them as a meticulously constructed plot. You see yourself as a victim of fate. I will show you that you are a victim of men." He began to speak, his voice as sharp and precise as a scalpel, dissecting the conspiracy layer by layer. "Let us begin with the instrument of your arrest, the letter of denunciation. You did not write it. Who then had both the motive and the knowledge to do so? Let us list the candidates. First, Danglars. He desired your captaincy. He was on the ship. He overheard your conversation with Morel. He knew of Elba. He knew of the letter. His motive, professional jealousy. Second, Fernand Mondego. He desired your fiancée, Mercedes. His motive, passional jealousy. He is a Catalan, a man of hot blood and deep resentments. We know from your own account that these two men were associates. It is a near certainty that they collaborated, with the cunning Danglars providing the plan and the volatile Fernand providing the impetus. Dantès stared at him, his mouth agape. The names, which he had always associated with simple envy, now took on a monstrous aspect. But, Faria continued, raising a thin, bony finger, their denunciation alone was a clumsy weapon. It would have triggered an investigation, yes, but an impartial magistrate would have quickly discovered your political innocence. Your story was believable. You were a pawn. You should have been released within a week. Why were you not? Because your case was not handled by an impartial magistrate. It was handled by the one man in all of France for whom your testimony was not a defense, but a death sentence. The abbé paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. You uttered the name of the letter's recipient, Noirtier, and you told me the prosecutor's name was de Villefort. Have you never considered the connection? In the circles I moved in, it was well known that the great Bonapartist agent, Noirtier, had a son who, to advance his career, had renounced his father's name and politics, adopting his mother's noble name of Villefort and becoming a rabid royalist. Edmond, the man to whom the letter was addressed, was Gérard de Villefort's own father. The revelation struck Dantès with the force of a physical blow. The world, which had been grey and senseless, suddenly snapped into a terrifying, crystal-clear focus. Do you see now? Faria pressed, his voice relentless. When you spoke that name, you transformed yourself from a minor nuisance into a mortal threat to Villefort's entire existence. His career, his marriage, his very life depended on that letter, and your knowledge of it disappearing forever. He did not burn the letter to save you, my poor, naive boy. He burned the evidence to save himself. And he did not send you here for a short precautionary detainment. He sent you here to be buried alive, to take his secret with you to a silent grave. Your accusers were Danglars and Fernand, but your executioner, the man who locked this door and threw away the key, was Villefort. In that moment, the last vestiges of the old Edmond Dantès, the hopeful boy, the forgiving man, were burned away. The amorphous sorrow in his heart, the dull ache of loss, crystallized into something new. It was a cold, hard, perfectly formed diamond of pure hatred. He now had names for his ghosts: Danglars, Fernand, Villefort. His desire for vengeance was no longer a hot, impotent rage. It was a cold, rational mission. The Abbé Faria had given him an education in the arts and sciences, but the true gift was this terrible, clarifying truth. He had given him a reason to live and a reason to kill. The years continued their slow march. Dantès' transformation was complete. He was no longer a prisoner, he was a scholar, a warrior in waiting. But as he grew stronger in mind and spirit, his mentor, the great abbé, began to fail. The long years of confinement had finally broken his frail body. He began to suffer from a rare and terrible malady, which he diagnosed himself as a form of apoplexy or catalepsy. The attacks would come without warning. A sudden seizure would rack his body, leaving him rigid, paralyzed, and seemingly dead for hours or even days at a time. During a lucid period after one such attack, Faria, knowing his time was short, decided to give his student his final inheritance. He gathered Dantès close, his voice a weak whisper. I had hoped to use my secret to help forge a new Italy, he said. But that dream is dead with me. I have no family. Edmond, you have become the son I never had. I will therefore make you my heir. He then recounted the fantastic story of the Spada family and their legendary lost treasure. He told of the cunning and avaricious Pope Alexander VI and his son, Caesar Borgia. He described the immense wealth of Cardinal Caesar Spada and the cardinal's desperate, brilliant plan to hide his fortune from the Borgia's grasp. He spoke of the small, rocky, uninhabited island of Monte Cristo and the secret cave where the cardinal had concealed a treasure beyond imagining, a hoard of Roman gold scudi, ingots of gold and silver, and a casket of priceless uncut gemstones. He explained how the secret of its location, written in invisible ink on a seemingly innocuous family document, had passed down through the centuries, its meaning lost until he, Faria, had accidentally discovered it by a fire. "The treasure is there, Edmond," Faria rasped, his eyes burning with a final, fierce intensity. "I give you the secret. I give you the means to reclaim your life. When you escape, go to Monte Cristo. The fortune is yours. Use it to reward the good. Do not forget the kindness of Monsieur Morel, and use it to punish the wicked. Let your vengeance be not an act of passion, but a work of art, an act of divine providence." With his failing memory, he dictated the precise, complex instructions for locating the cave on the island. Dantès, with his perfectly trained mind, committed every word, every landmark, every measurement to an indelible memory. The knowledge of this colossal fortune, a sum that could buy armies and topple kingdoms, was the final piece of the puzzle. He now had the intellect, the motive, and the means to orchestrate a retribution on a scale the world had never seen. The abbé's health deteriorated rapidly. A second seizure left him permanently paralyzed on his right side. Dantès became his full-time nurse, tending to his friend with a loving, gentle devotion, feeding him, cleaning him, and listening to his final words of wisdom. Then, one evening, the third and final attack came. It was swift and violent. The abbé cried out Dantès' name, his body convulsed, and then, with a final sigh, he was still. The brilliant light in his eyes, a light that had illuminated the darkness of the prison for so long, was gone. The Abbé Faria was dead. The grief that seized Dantès was absolute. He had lost his father, his teacher, his mentor, his only friend. He sat with the cold body for hours, his tears falling silently onto the old man's face. The silence of the cell was no longer peaceful. It was the absolute crushing silence of the tomb. He was alone again. He was roused from his stupor by the distant, rhythmic sound of footsteps in the corridor. The jailers. They were making their final round. They would come to his cell, as they did every night. They would discover the body. They would take it away and dump it in the sea, and he would be left in this cell, alone, until he too went mad or died. And in that abyss of total despair, a thought ignited in his mind. It was a thought so wild, so audacious, so blasphemous and brilliant that it could only have been born of such an extreme moment. It was a plan of terrifying simplicity. The jailers would come for the body. They would place it in a burial sack. They would carry it to the battlements and throw it into the sea. He acted. Galvanized by a surge of desperate energy, he sprang into motion. He lifted the frail, cold body of his friend and carried it through the tunnel into his own cell. He laid the abbé on his cot and pulled the thin, ragged blanket over him, arranging it to mimic the form of a sleeping man. He then crawled back into Faria's cell. On the floor lay the coarse, heavy canvas sack the jailers had left, anticipating the abbé's death. He took the small, sharp knife Faria had fashioned, a tool they had used for carving their pens. He laid the sack on the floor, took a deep breath, and slid his own living body inside. He drew the rough opening over his head, curling his body into the contorted, rigid posture of a corpse. He lay in the suffocating, pitch-black confines of the sack. The air was thick with the smell of canvas and death. His heart pounded a deafening rhythm in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to claw his way out, but he held himself perfectly still. It was the ultimate gamble, a desperate roll of the dice with his life as the stake. An eternity passed. Then he heard the grating sound of the key in the lock. The cell door opened. He heard the gruff voices of two jailers. He felt the sack being lifted. He was a dead weight in their arms. He was carried out of the cell, down the corridor, up a flight of stone stairs. Through the thick weave of the canvas, he felt the shocking, electric touch of the cold night air, a sensation he had not experienced in 14 years. He heard the whistle of the wind, the distant roar of the sea crashing against the rocks far below. He was on the battlements. He heard the men speak. "Is the ball ready?" one asked. He felt a sudden, immense weight being fastened to his ankles. A cannonball. His heart seized with a fresh wave of terror. This was real. This was happening. He heard the men grunt as they began to swing the sack back and forth, building momentum. 1, 2, 3, he was airborne. For a single, breathtaking moment, he felt the sensation of flight. Then gravity took hold, and he plunged downwards. The fall seemed to last an eternity. He hit the water with a bone-jarring, explosive impact. The cold was a physical blow, a paralytic shock that stole the breath from his lungs. The weight of the cannonball dragged him down, down, down into the black, churning abyss of the sea. The water was a crushing, silent prison. But he was prepared. This was the one part of the plan he had been able to foresee. His right hand still clutched the precious knife. With the last of the air burning in his lungs, he began to saw and slash at the thick canvas. The material was tough, resistant. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm him. Black spots danced before his eyes. His body screamed for air. The pressure was unbearable. Just as he felt his consciousness beginning to slip away into the blackness, the blade sliced through the final threads of the sack. He kicked himself free, a phantom escaping its shroud. He pushed off the sinking cannonball, his own macabre tombstone, and clawed his way upwards, towards a surface he could only pray was there. He burst through into the maelstrom and took a deep, ragged, glorious gasp of the storm-filled air. It was a breath of life, of freedom, of rebirth. He was alive. He was free. He was a tiny, insignificant speck, adrift in a raging tempest in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Behind him, the grim fortress of the Chateau d'If stood against the lightning-streaked sky, his tomb for 14 years. The innocent boy named Edmond Dantès was truly gone, dead and buried in the depths. The man who now swam for his life, his body filled with a strength born of unimaginable suffering and his mind armed with the wisdom of a great teacher, was someone else entirely. He was the heir to a legendary fortune and the designated agent of a slow, meticulous, and terrible reckoning. He was the living embodiment of providence. He was the Count of Monte Cristo. The immediate aftermath of freedom was an ordeal of pure, brutal survival. Edmond Dantès, reborn into the heart of a Mediterranean tempest, was a creature of raw instinct. The cold was a physical assault, a paralytic force that sought to lock his muscles and drag him back into the depths. Each wave was a liquid battering ram, lifting him on its crest before plunging him into a dark, churning trough. The salt spray, whipped into a stinging mist by the gale, blinded him, and the water he inevitably swallowed burned his throat and stomach. His prison rags, already threadbare, became a leaden shroud, clinging to his limbs and threatening to exhaust his precious, finite strength. For what felt like an eternity, he was simply a consciousness fighting against oblivion. The 14 years in the Chateau d'If, a period of physical inactivity, had left his body unconditioned for such a violent struggle. Yet, within that same body resided a will that had been forged in the crucible of absolute despair and tempered by the iron intellect of the Abbé Faria. He had not survived a living tomb only to perish in the sea. He forced his limbs to move, adopting a slow, energy-conserving stroke, his mind a cold, calculating machine, assessing his chances. He was surrounded by islands, but in the storm-tossed darkness, he had no sense of direction. To swim blindly was to invite exhaustion and death. His only hope was to stay afloat and pray for the storm to break, or for the miraculous appearance of a vessel. Hours passed. The initial shock of the cold subsided into a deep, penetrating chill that settled in his bones. His movements became sluggish, his thoughts clouded by fatigue. Despair, the old familiar enemy, began to whisper at the edges of his mind. And then, in a fleeting moment when the moon broke through a gap in the storm clouds, he saw it. To the west, a dark, jagged mass against the horizon. It was an island. He recognized its shape from the abbé's descriptions and his own long hours staring from his cell window. It was the Isle of Tiburon. He now had a heading, a destination. The knowledge gave him a fresh surge of adrenaline. He turned his body and began to swim, no longer just surviving, but moving towards a goal. The swim was a Herculean trial. The distance was several miles, and the sea fought him for every inch. He swallowed his pride and jettisoned his waterlogged trousers and shirt, the last remnants of his prison identity, sacrificing modesty for buoyancy. He swam on, a naked, solitary man, battling the elements, his mind fixed on the island. He was driven by the names that had become his mantra: Danglars, Fernand, Villefort. He was propelled by the memory of his father's love, Mercedes's face, and the abbé's final trusting gaze. He reached the rocky shore of the island just as the first, faint grey light of dawn was beginning to stain the eastern sky. He was not so much swimming as he was pushed by the waves, his body scraping against the sharp, barnacle-encrusted rocks. He found a small crevice, a sheltered nook in the granite, and crawled into it, collapsing onto the rough stone, his body shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. He lay there, listening to the storm slowly abate, and slept the sleep of the truly spent, the first sleep of a free man in 14 years. He awoke to the full light of day. The sun was out, the sky was a brilliant, washed-clean blue, and the sea, though still choppy, had lost its fury. He was stiff, sore, and ravenously hungry, but he was alive. As he surveyed his surroundings, he saw a small fishing vessel, a Genoese tartane, that had clearly sought shelter from the storm in a nearby cove. Hope surged through him once more. He swam out to the vessel, hailing it with a weak but clear voice. The sailors aboard, rough-looking men with faces weathered by sun and sea, regarded him with suspicion. A naked man swimming from a deserted rock was not a common sight. He was hauled aboard, a rope burn marking his chest. The captain, a grizzled Genoese named Gaetano, questioned him sharply. Here, Dantès' new persona, the first of many, was born. He drew upon the abbé's lessons in language and geography. He spoke in heavily accented Italian, claiming to be a Maltese sailor, a survivor from a merchant vessel that had gone down in the storm the previous night. He named the ship the Saint Ferdinand, gave a plausible cargo, and described its foundering with convincing detail. It was a flawless performance. The smugglers, for he quickly discerned that was their true trade, accepted his story. They gave him a pair of trousers, a woolen sailor's cap, a piece of dry biscuit, and a swig of cheap rum. To Edmond Dantès, it was a feast fit for a king. The ship, he learned, was the Jeune Amélie. It was a smuggler, running English cottons from the free port of Livorno to the French coast, bypassing the heavy tariffs. Dantès, with his years of experience as a sailor, offered his services. He was strong, knowledgeable, and willing to work for his passage. Captain Gaetano, seeing a capable hand, agreed, and so Edmond Dantès, the former first mate, became a common sailor once more, this time on a vessel that operated on the far side of the law. His integration into the crew was a masterclass in calculated subtlety. He did not boast of his former skills, but demonstrated them through quiet competence. He could tie any knot, read the weather in the clouds, and climb the rigging with a speed and confidence that earned the respect of the other sailors. The Abbé Faria's lessons proved invaluable. His knowledge of mathematics made him a navigator of unparalleled skill. He could calculate their position with a precision that seemed almost supernatural to the captain, who relied on dead reckoning and coastal landmarks. His fluency in several languages made him an indispensable asset in the various ports they visited, allowing him to negotiate and gather intelligence. He was no longer just a sailor. He was becoming the ship's most valuable asset. He cultivated a specific friendship with one of the crew, a young Corsican named Jacopo. Jacopo was a simple, honest man, fiercely loyal and possessed of a strong, if unrefined, moral code. Dantès saw in him a potential instrument. He earned Jacopo's friendship not through bribery, but through acts of service and wisdom. During a tense confrontation with a rival smuggling crew in a Livorno tavern, Dantès' calm demeanor and sharp words de-escalated a situation that was about to erupt into a knife fight. On another occasion, during a sudden squall, Jacopo was nearly swept overboard, and it was Dantès who, with lightning-fast reflexes, grabbed him and secured him with a rope. These acts forged a bond of deep loyalty. One night, while they shared a watch under a canopy of stars, Jacopo, in a moment of gratitude, swore an oath of fealty to Dantès. "If I had a master," he said, "I would want him to be you. If you ever need a hand, an arm, a life, Jacopo is yours." Dantès accepted the oath with a grave nod. He now had his first loyal soldier. For several months, Dantès lived the life of a smuggler. He sailed the Tyrrhenian Sea, learning the hidden coves of Corsica and Sardinia, the secret channels of the Tuscan archipelago. He was patient. He knew that the treasure of Monte Cristo had waited for centuries. It could wait a few months longer. He needed the perfect opportunity, a plausible reason to be on the island alone. He subtly began to speak of the island, weaving it into conversations as a place of legend, a potential rendezvous point. The opportunity finally presented itself during a planned smuggling run that would take them past the island. As the Jeune Amélie sailed within sight of the barren, rocky peak of Monte Cristo, Dantès put his plan into action. While supposedly adjusting a sail, he feigned a clumsy fall, letting out a convincing cry of pain as he landed hard on the deck. He writhed on the planks, clutching his leg and back, his face a mask of agony. The performance was so convincing that the crew, including the skeptical captain, believed he had suffered a serious internal injury, perhaps broken ribs or a fractured hip. He claimed to be unable to move, insisting that the motion of the ship was an unbearable torment. He begged them to leave him on the island of Monte Cristo to recover. "It is deserted," he pleaded. "I will find a cave, hunt some of the wild goats. You can pick me up on your return journey in a week. I will be no use to you in this condition." The crew debated. To leave a man behind, even at his own request, was a serious matter. But Jacopo argued fiercely on his friend's behalf, and the captain, reluctant to lose time on a potentially profitable run, eventually agreed. They carried Dantès ashore, leaving him with a small supply of biscuit, a flask of water, a loaded pistol, and a pickaxe, ostensibly for digging a fire pit and defending himself against wild animals. As the Jeune Amélie sailed away, disappearing over the horizon, Dantès watched it go. Then he stood up. His fall had been perfectly executed. He was completely unharmed. He was alone, on the island of his destiny. The silence that descended was absolute. After months on a crowded, creaking ship, the profound quiet of the island was almost deafening. It was a wild, beautiful, and desolate place. Jagged granite peaks rose to the sky, and the slopes were covered in tough, aromatic scrub, myrtle, and heather. Wild goats, the island's only significant inhabitants, leaped among the rocks. For the first time, Dantès allowed the full weight of his new reality to settle upon him. He was here. Faria's fantastic story was about to be put to the ultimate test. Was it the rambling of a dying old man, or the key to unimaginable power? He did not rush. He spent the first day reacclimatizing himself to solitude, hunting a goat with his pistol for food, and locating a freshwater spring. He was methodical, following the abbé's lessons in patience. The next morning, he began the search. He recited Faria's instructions from his perfect memory. From the small creek on the eastern side, walk 25 paces in a line towards the highest peak. You will find a large, dark rock. From there, turn your back to the sea and walk until you see two smaller rocks, one of which has been split by lightning. In the center of that triangle, the entrance lies. He followed the directions precisely. He found the creek. He paced off the 25 steps. He located the large, dark rock. He turned and walked. He found the two smaller rocks, one bearing the distinct, jagged scar of a lightning strike. He was in the correct location, but there was no cave entrance. There was only a solid wall of rock and earth, covered in thick, tangled undergrowth. For a terrifying moment, doubt assailed him. Had Faria's memory failed him? Was it all a cruel joke? He trusted the abbé. The entrance was not meant to be obvious. It was meant to be hidden. He took up the pickaxe and began to dig. The ground was hard, packed earth and stone. The sun beat down on his back. Sweat poured from him. He worked with a feverish, almost manic energy, driven by the hope of 14 years. For hours he dug, his hands blistering, his muscles screaming in protest. He struck solid rock. He dug around it. He cleared away tons of earth and stone. Finally, late in the afternoon, his pickaxe struck something that was not earth or stone. It made a hollow wooden sound. He cleared away the dirt frantically with his bare hands and uncovered a large flat stone, set horizontally. It had an iron ring set into it. This was it. The entrance. His heart hammered in his chest. He hooked the pickaxe under the ring and pulled with all his might. The stone was immensely heavy, sealed by centuries of damp earth. He strained, his muscles bulging, every fiber of his being focused on this single task. With a great groaning scrape, the stone began to move. He lifted it just enough to slide it aside, revealing a dark square opening leading down into the earth. A set of crudely carved stone steps descended into the blackness. A wave of cold, stale air, the trapped breath of centuries, washed over him. He lit a torch he had prepared from a pine branch and resin, and, taking a deep breath, he began his descent into the treasure cave of the Spada family. The steps led down into a large, circular cavern, clearly man-made, its walls smoothed by ancient tools. The air was thick and heavy, difficult to breathe. By the flickering light of his torch, he saw what the abbé had described. The cave was divided into 3 distinct compartments or niches. He walked to the first. There, resting on a stone plinth, was a large, iron-bound chest made of dark, ancient oak. It was not locked, but its heavy lid was swollen with damp and age. He wedged the pickaxe into the seam and pried it open. The lid creaked open with a sound like a dying groan. He held his torch over the open chest. His breath caught in his throat. The chest was filled to the brim with gold. Not jewelry, not artifacts, but coins. Thousands upon thousands of gleaming, perfectly preserved gold coins. Roman scudi, Florentine florins, Venetian ducats. A river of gold, shining with a soft, warm light under his torch. He plunged his hands into the coins, letting them run through his fingers. They were real. It was all real. He let out a laugh, a wild, unhinged sound that echoed strangely in the silent subterranean chamber. He moved to the second compartment. Here, he found not a chest, but neat stacks of heavy, oblong bars. He lifted one. It was astonishingly heavy. Gold and silver bullion, a fortune in raw, unminted precious metal. This was the raw material of power, the foundation of banks and kingdoms. Finally, he approached the third and final niche. Here sat a smaller, more elegant casket, bound in silver. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded, rotting velvet, lay the jewels. He had never seen such things. He was the son of a simple sailor. His world was one of fish and tar and rope. This was a sight from a dream, from a fairy tale. There were diamonds the size of hazelnuts, uncut but blazing with an internal, white-hot fire, even in the dim torchlight. There were rubies as red as pigeon's blood, emeralds as green as the deepest sea, and sapphires as blue as the twilight sky. There were pearls, ropes of them, each one perfect and lustrous. This was not just wealth. This was a concentration of beauty and value so immense it defied comprehension. He fell to his knees. The power represented by this cave was terrifying. It was the power to create and to destroy, to reward and to punish, to play the role of providence on earth. He wept. He wept for his lost youth, for his dead father, for the suffering of his beloved mentor, the Abbé Faria, who had given him this key to the world but had never been able to use it himself. And as he wept, his grief slowly, inexorably transmuted into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He now had the means. He would not fail. Dantès spent the next 6 days transporting the treasure. He found a smaller, more easily concealed cave nearby, and piece by piece moved the entire hoard, refilling the original cave and replacing the stone to leave no trace. He kept only a handful of gold coins and a few small diamonds for immediate use. When the Jeune Amélie returned, they found him looking pale and weak, but recovered. He paid Captain Gaetano handsomely for his rescue and his time, and then announced his intention to leave their service. He traveled with them to Livorno, where he sold 4 of the smallest diamonds to a Jewish merchant for a sum that left the man pale and trembling. With a fraction of this new wealth, he commissioned the construction of a small, swift, elegant yacht, complete with a secret compartment in its hull. While the yacht was being built, he sought out Jacopo. He found the Corsican on the docks and offered him a position as the foreman of his new yacht's crew. Jacopo, bewildered by his friend's sudden, inexplicable wealth, nonetheless accepted, without hesitation, his oath of loyalty unshaken. Dantès then made a request. "Jacopo," he said, "I need you to go to Marseille. I need you to ask after an old man named Louis Dantès and a young Catalan girl named Mercedes." Jacopo departed. Weeks later, he returned with a somber face. The news was as Dantès had feared. Louis Dantès had died of grief and starvation a few months after his son's arrest. Mercedes, after mourning Edmond for nearly 2 years, had finally succumbed to the persistent, desperate attentions of her cousin, Fernand Mondego. She had married him and had since disappeared from Marseille. The news landed like a hammer blow, but Dantès' face remained an unreadable mask. The last flickering embers of his old life were now extinguished. His path was clear. He purchased his new yacht, staffed it with a loyal crew vetted by Jacopo, and set a course for his old home. But he would not arrive as Edmond Dantès. He landed not at Marseille, but at a small port nearby. There he underwent his first true transformation. Using makeup and clothing purchased in Italy, he disguised himself. He became the Abbé Busoni, an Italian priest. He donned a black cassock, added subtle lines to his face to age him, and adopted a stooped posture and a pious, inquisitive air. His command of Italian was, of course, flawless. Thus disguised, he made his way to the inn at the Pont du Gard, an establishment he knew to be run by his old neighbor, Gaspard Caderousse. He found Caderousse and his wife, the shrewish La Carconte, living in a state of modest but grasping prosperity. Caderousse had aged, his face coarsened by drink and dissatisfaction. Dantès, as Busoni, introduced himself as a priest tasked with executing the will of a fellow prisoner who had recently died in the Château d'If, a wealthy Englishman who had known a young sailor named Edmond Dantès. The prisoner, he claimed, had left a diamond of considerable value to be divided among his 5 true friends: Dantès' father, Caderousse, Danglars, Fernand, and Mercédès. This was the bait. Caderousse's eyes lit up with greed at the sight of the diamond, a magnificent stone worth 50,000 francs. "But Abbé," he stammered, "Dantès' father is dead. And as for the others, they are not his friends, they are his betrayers." Dantès feigned shock and pious disbelief. "Betrayers? My son, you must explain yourself. I cannot give this sacred inheritance to the unworthy." And so, with the magnificent diamond glittering on the table between them, Caderousse, lubricated by wine provided by the priest, began to talk. He poured out the entire, sordid story. He confessed his own role, his cowardly presence at the tavern when the plot was hatched. He described in detail Danglars' cold, cunning intellect as he wrote the letter of denunciation, and Fernand's passionate, desperate jealousy as he mailed it. The Abbé Busoni listened, his face a mask of sorrowful piety, while inside, the heart of Edmond Dantès turned to ice. He asked about the others. What had become of them? Caderousse, now eager to ingratiate himself, revealed everything. Danglars, he explained, had used his cunning to leave Morel's service and had moved to Spain, where he made a fortune as a provisioner for the French army. He had become a banker, a millionaire, and had been made a baron. He was now one of the most powerful financiers in Paris. And Fernand? Fernand, Caderousse spat, had done even better. He had joined the army during the Napoleonic Wars. During the campaign in Greece, he had entered the service of the Ali Pasha of Janina. He had betrayed his master to the Turks, sold the Pasha's wife and daughter into slavery, and returned to France with a colossal fortune. He had changed his name to the Count de Morcerf, entered politics, and was now a peer of France, a celebrated general, a man of immense power and prestige. And his wife, the Countess de Morcerf, was the once humble Catalan girl, Mercédès. And what of Monsieur Morel, the one man who had tried to help him? Caderousse shrugged. Morel, he said, had suffered a series of terrible misfortunes. Ship after ship had been lost at sea. His business had collapsed. He was now on the brink of absolute ruin, his good name about to be dishonored by bankruptcy. Dantès had his answers. The guilty had prospered beyond all imagination. The virtuous had been crushed. The scales of justice were not merely unbalanced, they had been shattered. He made his decision. He declared that since Caderousse was the only one who had shown even a flicker of remorse, the entire diamond belonged to him. He handed the priceless gem to the stunned innkeeper. "Use it to live an honest life," the abbé advised, his voice hollow. He then took his leave, disappearing into the night, leaving Caderousse and his wife to their greedy, ultimately fatal prize. Dantès' next act required a new disguise. He travelled to Marseille and presented himself at the nearly bankrupt offices of Morel & Son. He was now Lord Wilmore, a laconic, eccentric English nobleman, supposedly an agent of the London-based banking house of Thompson and French, to whom Morel owed a vast sum. He saw the despair in the office, the loyalty of the young clerk, Emmanuel Herbeau, the quiet dignity of Morel's daughter, Julie, and the profound, soul-crushing despair on the face of Morel himself, a once proud man now utterly broken. Playing his role, Lord Wilmore granted Morel a 3-month extension on his debts. a small act of mercy that Morel received with baffled gratitude. Dantès then disappeared. For 3 months, he worked behind the scenes. He used his immense, untraceable wealth to buy Morel's outstanding debts from all his other creditors. He also commissioned the construction of an exact replica of the Pharaon, the ship that had been the beginning of both his fortune and his ruin. On the final day of the 3-month extension, the day Morel was to face public dishonor or take his own life, Dantès enacted his plan. He had Julie Morel follow a set of mysterious instructions delivered in a letter from Sinbad the sailor. The instructions led her to a small apartment where she found a red silk purse containing a diamond identical to the one given to her mother as a dowry, along with a receipt marking all her father's debts as paid in full. As she raced back to her father's house, the new pharaon, fully laden with cargo and identical in every detail to the original, sailed majestically into the port of Marseille. Monsieur Morel, who had been holding a pistol to his head, was saved at the final second. His fortune was restored, his honor was saved, his family was secure. From a hidden vantage point on a nearby hill, Edmond Dantès watched the scene of ecstatic, weeping, incomprehensible joy at the Morel house. He had performed his first act as Providence. He had rewarded the good. A profound and terrible joy filled him. He had tasted the power of a god. Now he turned his eyes towards Paris, towards the wicked. Their time of reckoning was at hand. He had tested his power. Now he would unleash it. The 9 years that elapsed between the salvation of the House of Morel and the Count of Monte Cristo's arrival in Paris were not a period of idleness, but one of profound, focused, and relentless self-construction. Having proven his capacity to act as a benevolent force, Edmond Dantès now turned his entire being to the task of becoming the perfect instrument of retribution. He understood that to dismantle the lives of men who stood at the apex of society, he could not simply be a rich man. He had to become a force of nature, a figure of myth, a man unbound by the conventional laws and mores of the world he was about to enter. This required a final, transformative journey. He traveled east, deliberately plunging himself into cultures where time was measured in dynasties, not seasons, and where justice was often a slow, patient poison rather than a swift blade. In Cairo and Constantinople, he moved through the labyrinthine corridors of the Ottoman court, observing the intricate dance of eunuchs, viziers, and spies. He learned how power could be wielded through a whisper, how empires could be destabilized by a rumor, how the most powerful pashas could be undone by the subtle exploitation of a single hidden weakness. He studied the art of the long game, the patient cultivation of influence that could take decades to bear fruit. He sought out knowledge that was alien to the West. In the hidden pharmacies of Damascus, he learned from aged herbalists the secrets of rare plants and mineral compounds. He became a master toxicologist, not to kill, but to control. He learned of substances that could induce a sleep so deep it perfectly mimicked death, of potions that could create vivid hallucinations, of powders that could cloud the judgment or inflame the passions. These were not the crude poisons of the Borgias. They were sophisticated tools for psychological warfare, instruments to manipulate the very reality of his chosen victims. In the mountains of Persia and the plains of India, his education took a more metaphysical turn. He sought out mystics and ascetics, men who had mastered the relationship between mind and body. He learned techniques of meditation that allowed him to achieve a state of preternatural calm, to wall off his emotions so they would never betray him. He practiced disciplines that gave him conscious control over his own autonomic functions, learning to slow his heartbeat to a barely perceptible flutter, to lower his body temperature, to endure great pain without flinching. He was stripping away the last vestiges of the passionate, reactive Edmond Dantès and replacing him with a being of pure, cold, implacable will. During this period, he also built his network. His immense wealth, managed through a web of anonymous accounts in every major financial capital, allowed him to purchase loyalty on an epic scale. He acquired agents, spies, and informants. He had men in the French Ministry of War, clerks in the Prefecture of Police, and servants in the households of influential politicians. He also assembled his personal retinue. He found Bertuccio, the Corsican smuggler with a blood feud against Villefort, and made him his loyal steward. He took the Nubian Ali, a mute of incredible strength and loyalty whose tongue had been cut out, and made him his personal bodyguard and attendant. He found the beautiful Greek princess Haide, the orphaned daughter of the Ali Pasha of Janina, in a slave market in Constantinople. He purchased her, but instead of making her a concubine, he made her his ward, his princess, raising her in seclusion and luxury. He nurtured her memories, sharpened her thirst for vengeance against the man who had betrayed her father, and cultivated her as his single most important living weapon. He was no longer a man, he was an enterprise, an intelligence agency, a force of destiny with a vast and intricate support structure. And all the while, he was carefully crafting the legend of the Count of Monte Cristo. He would appear briefly in a port, buy a priceless artifact for a handful of gold, and disappear. He would anonymously finance a charitable work in one city and be rumored to have caused a financial panic in another. The name Monte Cristo began to be whispered in the exclusive circles of power and wealth, a name synonymous with limitless riches and profound, unsettling mystery. He was building his own myth, ensuring that when he finally arrived, he would be preceded by an aura of the supernatural. His re-entry into European society was timed with the precision of a master strategist. He chose the Roman Carnival of 1838. Rome, during Carnival, was a temporary colony of Paris, a place where the French aristocracy came to play. It was here that he orchestrated his encounter with Albert de Morcerf, the son of Fernand Mondego, and his friend, the thoughtful and observant Baron Franz d'Épinay. The Count rented an entire floor of the most exclusive hotel, surrounding himself with an opulence that was both staggering and tastefully foreign. He was a figure of quiet, immense authority, his conversation hinting at a knowledge of the world that was both ancient and deeply cynical. He observed the young men, noting Albert's easy charm, his romanticism, his youthful arrogance, and his deep love for his parents. He noted Franz's more cautious, analytical nature. He understood that Albert was the perfect vector, the ideal, unwitting agent to carry him into the heart of his enemy's world. The plan he set in motion was a masterpiece of stagecraft. He subtly encouraged Albert's desire for a Roman adventure, then used his agent, the powerful bandit chief Luigi Vampa, a man whose life the Count had once saved and who was now bound to him by an unbreakable oath, to kidnap the young Viscount. The abduction and subsequent rescue were pure theatre. Albert was taken to Vampa's lair deep within the ancient catacombs, a setting chosen for its dramatic, Gothic effect. He was treated with a theatrical ferocity that terrified him, and then, at the moment of his deepest despair, the Count of Monte Cristo appeared. He did not fight, he did not bargain. He simply spoke a few quiet words to Vampa, and the fearsome bandit and his men bowed before him as if to a king. Albert, utterly overwhelmed, saw the Count not as a man, but as a demigod, a figure from a romantic novel. He swore an oath of eternal gratitude and friendship, insisting that the Count must come to Paris and allow him the honor of introducing him to his world. The Count, feigning a world-weary reluctance, accepted. The first and most crucial move on the grand chessboard had been made. The Count's arrival in Paris was not an event, it was a phenomenon. He took up residence in a magnificent mansion at number 30, Avenue des Champs-Élysées. The house was chosen with cold, symbolic precision. It had once belonged to the Marquis de Saint-Méran, the father of Gérard de Villefort's first wife, a place tied to the history of one of his primary targets. The interior was a reflection of the Count's persona, a fusion of European elegance and Eastern exoticism. The salons were filled with the finest French furniture, but the walls were hung with priceless Ottoman silks. A visitor might find a Grecian statue in one room and a divan fit for a sultan in the next. The air was subtly scented with rare, unidentifiable incenses. It was a space designed to both welcome and intimidate, to display wealth while hinting at a life lived far beyond the comprehension of his guests. He also purchased a second property, a country house in the placid suburb of Auteuil. This house was his true base of operations, his secret heart. It was the very house where, more than 2 decades earlier, Villefort had attempted to bury his illegitimate newborn son. The Count knew every secret of this property, every loose floorboard, every hidden passage. The garden where Villefort had committed his crime was now the Count's private sanctuary. Through the enthusiastic sponsorship of Albert de Morcerf, the Count was launched into the stratosphere of Parisian society. He attended the opera, hosted dinners, and was presented at the most exclusive salons. He met his enemies, one by one, in their natural habitats. He saw them not as the callow, desperate young men he remembered, but as pillars of the state, draped in honors, titles, and immense wealth. They were secure, arrogant, and utterly oblivious. They looked at the Count of Monte Cristo and saw a potential business partner, a social curiosity, a stepping stone. They had no idea they were looking into the face of their own damnation. His first systematic assault was aimed at Baron Danglars. Danglars, the cold-hearted purser who had penned the denunciation, was now a titan of finance. His world was the bourse, the stock exchange. His god was capital. His identity was built on the foundation of his infallible financial judgment. The Count understood that to destroy Danglars, he must not simply take his money, he must shatter the man's faith in his own genius to make him doubt the very foundations of his existence. The campaign began with a gesture of overwhelming trust. The Count opened an account with the Bank of Danglars, depositing a staggering sum of 5 million francs in cash. He then, with a casual air, requested a letter of unlimited credit, allowing him to draw any sum from Danglars' correspondence in any city in the world. Danglars, whose greed immediately overrode his caution, saw the Count as the ultimate client. The potential profits were enormous. He granted the unlimited credit, binding his own financial fate to this mysterious nobleman. Then the psychological warfare began. The Count, through his vast network of agents, began to feed Danglars misinformation. He used his private telegraph line, an unheard-of luxury, to manipulate information about the Spanish bond market. He would create a panic, causing Danglars to sell at a massive loss. The very next day, the market would inexplicably recover, making those who held their nerve a fortune. The Count then engineered a situation where Danglars made a spectacular profit, a calculated move to restore a sliver of the banker's confidence before the next blow. He was playing with Danglars as a cat plays with a mouse, allowing it moments of hope before the next painful squeeze. The banker, once so arrogant and certain, became a nervous wreck, his sleep plagued by anxiety, his days spent staring at the telegraph machine, a prisoner of the very system he had once mastered. The Count's attack extended to the Baron's family, a unit held together not by affection but by financial convenience. He learned of Madame Danglars' long-standing affair with Lucien Debray, a government official who supplied her with insider information for her own private stock speculations. The Count, with a few carefully placed words, exposed the fact that Debray's information was now costing her money, not making it, sowing discord and mistrust between the lovers. He also targeted the planned marriage between Danglars' daughter, Eugénie, and Albert de Morcerf. The Count discovered Eugénie's deep-seated aversion to marriage and her secret desire for an independent life as an artist with her companion, Louise d'Armilly. He presented himself as a sympathetic patron, encouraging her artistic ambitions and praising her desire for freedom, thereby subtly sabotaging the dynastic union that was so important to her father. The foundations of the House of Danglars were being systematically hollowed out, leaving only a fragile facade ready to collapse. His second front opened against the Count de Morcerf, formerly the fisherman Fernand Mondego. Fernand's crimes were betrayal and murder, his rewards fame, status, and a hero's reputation. His entire life was a lie built upon a foundation of false honor. The Count's strategy was not to attack his fortune, but to strip him naked before the world, to annihilate the heroic myth he had so carefully constructed. The weapon for this assault was Haydée, the daughter of the Ali Pasha of Janina. The Count had kept her in luxurious seclusion, a secret waiting to be deployed. He now introduced her into society, not as a ward, but as his slave, a deliberately provocative term designed to pique curiosity. She would appear at his social gatherings, a vision of exotic beauty and profound, tragic sorrow, never speaking unless addressed by him. The Count then began to tell a story at his dinner parties. It was the story of the great Ali Pasha, his bravery, his wealth, and his ultimate betrayal by a trusted French officer in his service. He would tell the story in the presence of Albert de Morcerf, watching the young man's reactions. Then he arranged for the full, detailed story to be published in a leading opposition newspaper, delivered by an anonymous source from Janina. The article was a sensation. It detailed the betrayal, the murder of the Pasha, and the selling of his wife and daughter into slavery. It did not name Morcerf, but the details, the rank, the time, the place, were so precise that the accusation was unmistakable. Morcerf, in his hubris, walked directly into the trap. Outraged, he demanded a public inquiry before the Chamber of Peers, the highest assembly in the land, to defend his honor. The inquiry was a grand piece of political theatre. Morcerf stood before his peers, draped in his general's uniform, and delivered a powerful, indignant denial. He was the picture of a wronged hero. At the climax of his speech, the Count made his move. The doors of the chamber opened, and Haydée entered. She was not the timid slave his guests had seen. She was a vengeful princess, dressed in regal Greek attire, her bearing proud and terrible. She stood before the assembly and, in flawless French, delivered her testimony. She was the daughter of the Ali Pasha. She had witnessed the betrayal with her own eyes. She identified the traitor, Fernand Mondego. As her final, irrefutable proof, she described a scar on the traitor's hand, a scar he had received while pushing her father's dying body into the lake. She pointed at the Count de Morcerf. "Look at his right hand," she commanded. All eyes turned to Fernand. He instinctively hid his hand. His guilt was written on his face. The Chamber of Peers erupted in chaos. Fernand Mondego's honor was not just questioned, it was utterly and publicly incinerated. The consequences were swift. Albert, who had worshipped his father, was devastated. His world destroyed. He fell back on the only thing he had left, the concept of honor. Believing the Count to be the hidden hand behind the newspaper article, he challenged him to a duel. This created a crisis for Dantès. His intricate plan had never accounted for this. To kill the son of the woman he had once loved would make him a monster. He could not do it. It was Mercédès who saved them both. The Countess de Morcerf had known the Count's true identity from the moment their eyes had met. The years had carved new lines on his face and filled his eyes with a terrifying coldness. But she saw the ghost of her Edmond within. On the eve of the duel, she came to the Count's mansion. It was a meeting freighted with the sorrow of 23 lost years. She did not plead for her husband's life. She knew his guilt. She pleaded for her son's. "Edmond," she whispered, the name a painful relic on her tongue. "I know what they did to you, but he is my son. He is innocent. Do not let his father's sins be visited upon him." Faced with her anguish, the Count's armor of vengeance cracked. For a moment, the cold, calculating god became a man again, feeling the ache of a love he thought long dead. He agreed to spare Albert. He resolved to let the boy kill him in the duel, a final, self-immolating act. But Mercédès took one further desperate step. She went to Albert and revealed the entire terrible truth. The story of the young sailor, Edmond Dantès, the plot by Danglars and her cousin Fernand, the source of their family's name and fortune in an act of vile treachery. The next morning, at the dueling ground, Albert de Morcerf did not raise his pistol. He walked over to the Count and, in front of all the witnesses, publicly apologized. He acknowledged his father's profound guilt and the Count's right to seek justice. He renounced his father's name, title, and blood-soaked fortune. The duel was aborted. Albert, with his mother, walked away from their life of luxury, choosing a future of poverty and penance. Fernand Mondego, returning to his mansion to find it empty, his honor gone, his family abandoned, and his past closing in on him, put a pistol to his head and ended his life. The second column of the Count's revenge had crumbled into dust. The final and most intricate campaign was reserved for Gérard de Villefort. Villefort, the man of the law, the procureur du roi, was the ultimate hypocrite. His sin was the wrapping of personal ambition and criminality in the robes of justice. The Count's revenge, therefore, had to be an implosion, a destruction that came from within Villefort's own family, within his own courtroom. The Count had spent years setting the stage. His key pawn was Benedetto, the illegitimate son of Villefort, and Madame Danglars, the child Villefort had tried to bury alive. The Count, through his agent Bertuccio, had tracked the boy's wretched life, a journey through poverty and crime that had landed him in the galleys. The Count had him freed, educated him, and provided him with a new, glittering identity, the Viscount Andrea Cavalcanti, a wealthy young Italian nobleman. He then launched this charming, sociopathic creation into Parisian society, where he was quickly betrothed to Eugénie Danglars, a move that simultaneously pleased and tormented her father. While this long-term plot was maturing, the Count turned his attention to the Villefort household itself, a place of quiet, simmering toxicity. He discovered that Villefort's second wife, Heloise, was a modern-day Lucrezia Borgia. Driven by a fanatical desire to secure the entire family fortune for her spoiled, sickly son, Edouard, she was secretly poisoning her way through the family tree. The Count, with his master's knowledge of toxicology, did not intervene directly. Instead, he became the house's chorus, its oracle. After the sudden death of Villefort's parents-in-law, the Saint-Méran, the Count would casually remark upon the similarity of the symptoms to certain rare poisons. He sowed an atmosphere of creeping dread, turning the luxurious home into a Gothic stage of fear and suspicion. He watched as the poisoner, emboldened, claimed her next victim, Villefort's servant Barrois. Her final target was Villefort's daughter from his first marriage, the gentle Valentine, whose inheritance stood in the way of young Edouard's. But here, the Count's plan was complicated by his own lingering humanity. Valentine was the beloved of Maximilien Morel, the son of the one man who had shown him unwavering kindness. He could not allow this innocent girl, a symbol of the goodness he still cherished, to become collateral damage. He devised a plan of exquisite complexity. He visited Valentine in secret, revealing the identity of the poisoner and giving her a powerful, non-lethal narcotic of his own creation. The potion would induce a cataleptic state, a deep trance that perfectly mimicked death. He ensured Maximilien witnessed her apparent death, pushing the young man into a state of profound, suicidal despair. He then made Maximilien a solemn promise. If he would agree to live for 1 month, no matter the pain, the Count would cure him of his sorrow. It was a test of faith, a demand for absolute trust. The dead Valentine was taken to the family crypt, from which the Count, using his network, secretly removed her body and transported her to safety on the island of Monte Cristo. The endgame arrived in the main courtroom of the Palais de Justice. Andrea Cavalcanti, his life of crime having caught up with him, was on trial for murder. The presiding prosecutor demanding the death penalty with righteous fury was his own father, Gérard de Villefort. At the climax of the trial, just as Villefort was about to deliver his final, damning summation, Benedetto played the trump card the Count had given him. He revealed his true parentage, recounting in lurid detail the story of his birth and his father's attempt to bury him alive in the garden at Auteuil. The public revelation was a lightning bolt that shattered the foundations of the courtroom. The great man of justice was exposed as a fraud, a hypocrite, and an attempted murderer. His career, his reputation, his very identity were annihilated in an instant. Villefort, his mind cracking under the strain, fled the courtroom and staggered home, only to find a scene of even greater horror. His wife, Heloise, driven to madness by his discovery of her crimes and his cold command that she administer justice to herself, had done so, but had taken their son with her. She had poisoned young Edouard before taking her own life. Villefort discovered the bodies of his wife and his adored son. The sight of the innocent child, a victim of a chain of events he himself had set in motion, finally broke him. His sanity snapped. When the Count of Monte Cristo arrived at the house to deliver the final crushing blow of his true identity, "Look at me, Villefort. I am Edmond Dantès." The words fell on deaf ears. Villefort was on his knees in the garden, digging frantically in the dirt with his bare hands, calling out for his lost child. He was hopelessly, permanently insane. The third enemy was neutralized, but the victory was profoundly bitter. The death of the child Edouard was a consequence the Count had not intended. It was a stain on his perfect revenge. He looked at the ruin he had wrought, and for the first time, a terrible doubt entered his soul. Had he, in his quest for justice, become a monster himself? His final piece of business was with Danglars. The banker, financially ruined and publicly disgraced, had absconded with 5 million francs belonging to the city's hospitals, using the Count's letter of unlimited credit. The Count, his purpose now grim rather than triumphant, pursued him to Rome. He had Luigi Vampa's bandits capture Danglars and imprison him in the same catacombs where Albert had been held. But his torture was not physical, it was symbolic. He starved the banker, offering him food and drink at grotesquely inflated prices, forcing him to buy his survival with his own stolen money. A fowl cost 100,000 francs, a bottle of wine, 50,000. Day by day, Danglars watched his ill-gotten fortune disappear down his own throat. When Danglars was on the verge of death from starvation, his fortune spent, his spirit broken, the Count finally revealed himself. He was no longer the magnificent nobleman, but the gaunt spectre of Edmond Dantès. "The men you wronged, Danglars, died of hunger," he said, his voice a hollow echo. "One, my father, of hunger of the body. The other, me, of hunger for freedom. I have watched you suffer as you made me suffer. Now, I forgive you, for I, too, must be forgiven for having gone too far." He gave the broken man the last 50,000 francs and set him free, a white-haired, penniless wretch condemned to wander the world with nothing but the memory of his wealth and his crimes. His work was done, his enemies were destroyed. The scales were balanced. He returned to his island, to Maximilian, who was on the brink of suicide after his month of despair. He led the young man into the grotto, where he revealed Valentine, alive, beautiful, and waiting for him. He reunited the lovers, the one pure, good outcome of his terrible campaign, and he bestowed upon them a significant portion of his fortune. In a final letter left for Maximilian, the Count reckoned with his own soul. He confessed his doubt, his horror at the death of the innocent Edouard, and his realization that ultimate justice belongs only to God. He had been an agent of Providence, but the role was too vast for any mortal to bear. He left the young couple with the sum of all his wisdom, the distillation of 24 years of suffering and retribution, weight and hope. As the sun rose over the Mediterranean, Maximilian and Valentine watched from the shore of Monte Cristo as the Count's elegant yacht unfurled its white sails. On the deck stood the Count, and beside him, Haydée, the princess who had devoted her life to him and now offered him a future beyond vengeance. The ship caught the morning breeze and sailed towards the horizon, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a white speck against the vastness of the sea, finally disappearing into the light. The Count of Monte Cristo, having settled his account with humanity, sailed away to become a myth once more, leaving the world of men and their petty justices far behind him. Thus, the vessel carrying the Count of Monte Cristo and his companion, Haydée, recedes from our view, a solitary white sail against the immense canvas of the sea and the dawn. It is not a return to any known shore, not a voyage to France or Italy or any part of the world he has conquered or known. It is a departure into the realm of myth, a final, deliberate dissolution of his worldly identity. The man who had emerged from the sea as a force of nature now returns to it, his grand and terrible experiment in justice finally complete. The central question that hangs in the wake of his ship is whether the man who sought to embody divine providence had succeeded in his task, or had merely proven that such a role is untenable for any mortal. The destruction of his enemies was, by any measure, absolute. He did not simply kill them or bankrupt them. He orchestrated their ruin with a precision that was both poetic and terrifying, dismantling their lives using the very sins upon which they had built their fortunes and reputations. Danglars, the man of money, was ruined by money. Morcerf, the man of false honor, was ruined by the public annihilation of that honor. Villefort, the man of corrupt law, was ruined by the implosion of his family and the exposure of his own criminality in the heart of his own courtroom. In this, the Count's success was total. He was a perfect and flawless instrument of cause and effect. Yet, the victory was not without its profound and bitter cost, a cost that ultimately forced the Count to confront the limitations of his self-appointed role. The death of the innocent Edouard de Villefort served as a catastrophic moral check, a devastating piece of collateral damage that proved his calculations were not, in fact, divine. An innocent had perished within the gears of his great machine, a child sacrificed on the altar of his righteous campaign. This event shattered the Count's cold certainty. It introduced doubt into the heart of his mission, forcing him to acknowledge that in his quest to mete out perfect justice, he had overstepped a crucial boundary. He had perhaps become a mirror of the very forces that had created him, a bringer of suffering, albeit for a different cause. In his final acts, we witness a conscious retreat from the godlike power he had wielded. He does not kill Danglars, his first and most calculating enemy. Instead, after a period of symbolic torture, he forgives him. Forgiveness is an act of humanity, not of divinity. It is an acknowledgement of shared fallibility. He bestows his fortune and his blessing upon Maximilian and Valentine, nurturing a simple human love that his own life of vengeance had rendered impossible for himself. These are the acts of a man stepping down from a throne that has become too painful to occupy. The ultimate wisdom of the narrative, therefore, is not found in the Count's spectacular triumph, but in the simple, human counsel he leaves as his legacy to Maximilian: wait and hope. It is a repudiation of his own life's work. His life had been one of action, of agency, of seizing control and bending the world to his will. The path he advocates for at the end is one of patience, of faith, of endurance, the very qualities he had abandoned the moment he became the master of the Spada treasure. The story of Edmond Dantès, therefore, concludes not as a simple and satisfying tale of revenge, but as a profound and cautionary meditation on the nature of justice, the corrupting influence of absolute power, and the quiet, enduring strength found not in vengeance, but in human forgiveness, love, and the humble hope for a better dawn. The Count of Monte Cristo, having balanced the scales, now leaves the world to find out if there is anything left of Edmond Dantès, the man. And with that, our long journey through this magnificent, sprawling story comes to a close. We have spent a great deal of time together in this world of grand injustice and even grander retribution. From the sunny quays of Marseille to the grim darkness of the Château d'If, from the treasure caves of a deserted island to the gilded salons of Paris. Thank you for lending me your time and your attention through it all. The story is over now. The characters have played their parts. The Count has sailed away, and all that is left is the quiet of this moment, right here, right now. The world of the book can fade, leaving only the space you are in. Wherever you may be listening from, whether the night is dark and deep around you, or a quiet day is gently drawing to its end, I hope our time together has brought you some measure of peace. I hope it has quieted your mind, settled your thoughts, and perhaps prepared you for a deep and truly restful sleep. There are no more plots to uncover, no more fates to decide. There is only rest. May your own rest be untroubled, and may your dreams be peaceful. Until we meet for our next story, sleep well. Good night.